happens when Harry Potter is raised not by the Dursleys, but by the Peaky Blinders. Not soft, not innocent, not broken. Raised by Tommy Shelby, Harry learns loyalty, power, strategy, and how to survive in a world where weakness gets buried. So when he enters Hogwarts, he doesn't come in as a lost boy looking for answers. He comes in like a future empire builder. This is a darker, smarter, more ruthless Harry Potter story, and I've divided it into 6 chapters so the full journey flows perfectly from beginning to end. So subscribe, like the video, and share it with anyone who loves powerful Harry Potter what-if stories. Now, let's start with Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. The Inheritance Small Heath, October 1981. Polly said the boy had his mother's eyes. Tommy said that was the part that worried him. Rain made Birmingham look honest. It washed soot-off brick, turned the gutters black, and hammered the streets flat until every lamp in Small Heath wore the same dim yellow halo. The betting shop had closed hours ago, the shutters were down, and still Tommy Shelby sat awake behind his desk as though sleep were a thing meant for other men. A cigarette burned between his fingers. The room smelled of paper, smoke, damp wool, and money. He had been reading the accounts for a transport business he did not trust when he heard the motor outside, not a car, something louder, stranger. Tommy looked up. The engine cut out. A moment later, the front door opened without knocking, and Arthur swore from somewhere down the hall. "Tommy." Polly's voice called, calm as ever, "Put the gun away." That, more than anything, made him reach for it. He stood as the office door opened, and Polly Gray stepped in, rain on her coat, her dark hair pinned back, her expression composed in exactly the way it became when she was about to do something that would inconvenience everyone else in the room. Beside her, bent nearly in half to clear the frame, stood the biggest man Tommy Shelby had ever seen. The giant smelled of wet leather and wood smoke. His beard was soaked. In his arms, wrapped in blankets far too fine for Small Heath, was a sleeping child. Tommy's eyes went first to the man, then to the bundle, then back to Polly. "No," he said at once. Polly closed the door behind her. "You haven't heard what I'm saying yet." "I don't need to." Arthur appeared at the office entrance a heartbeat later, already halfway to laughter at the sight before he stopped himself. "What in God's name—" "Inside," Polly said. Arthur came in. John came behind him, sleeves rolled, curiosity bright in his face. The giant shifted awkwardly and ducked his head. "Evenin'," he said. His voice sounded like furniture being moved. "Rubeus Hagrid. I was told to bring the boy here by Professor Dumbledore." Tommy's eyes narrowed. "Were you?" Hagrid nodded earnestly and produced an envelope from inside his coat. It bore a heavy red seal pressed with a mark Tommy didn't recognize. Polly took it before Tommy could, opened it, and laid the letter on the desk. It was brief, formal, written in a hand that looked old-fashioned enough to be either distinguished or ridiculous. "Mr. Hagrid, due to revised security considerations, the child is to be placed temporarily with Mrs. Polly Gray in Birmingham until further arrangements are made. She has been briefed. This order supersedes the previous instruction." Albus Dumbledore, there was more beneath it, a flourish, a symbol, something that looked official. Tommy read it once, then again, then he looked up at Polly. "Temporarily," he said. "That's what it says." "That's what it says?" Tommy repeated, and there was the faintest edge under the words now, because Polly's face had become unreadable, which usually meant she was the only person in the room who knew what was truly happening. Hagrid, oblivious, stepped forward and lowered the child carefully into Tommy's chair as if he were setting down a crate of dynamite. The baby slept on. There was a thin lightning bolt scar on his forehead. Black hair, a face too serious, even in sleep, and eyes that opened, just for a second, green as cut glass. Tommy went still. Polly saw it happen. She had known it would. The baby looked at Tommy once, as though measuring him, then yawned and shut his eyes again. Arthur let out a breath through his nose. "He's tiny." "He's 1 year old," Polly said. "I know how old babies are, Paul." "No, you don't," she said. John leaned over the chair, grinning. "What's his name?" Hagrid swallowed. Harry Potter." Something in the room shifted around the name, not visibly, not in a way any one of them could have explained. But Tommy felt it all the same, a pressure like weather moving behind walls. He looked back to the letter, then to Hagrid, then to Polly. Who are his people? Hagrid hesitated. Dead! The word dropped into the office and stayed there. Both, Polly asked, gentler than Tommy had expected. Hagrid nodded. They were good people. Tommy studied him. Good people in Tommy's experience usually ended up buried, broke, or betrayed. Often all three. And why, Tommy said, is a dead couple's child being moved around Birmingham in the middle of the night by a man who looks like a pub legend? Arthur barked a laugh. Hagrid looked faintly offended. I was instructed to keep the boy safe. Safe from what? Hagrid's eyes flicked just once to the scar. That, he said, is a long story. Tommy considered pressing. Polly spared him the need. You've done your part, she told Hagrid. You can leave him with us. Hagrid looked relieved, which Tommy filed away immediately. Men were most honest in the second after they believed a burden had been taken off them. He lingered over the boy one moment longer, his face unexpectedly soft. Right then, he murmured. Good luck, Harry. Then he straightened, nearly hit his head on the doorway, and left as abruptly as he had arrived. The motor roared outside, faded, was gone, silence settled. Arthur stared at the child, John stared at Polly, Tommy stared at the letter. Then, very carefully, he picked it up and held it near the lamp. The paper was expensive, the handwriting smooth, the seal convincing, but not convincing enough. He set it down. You forged it, he said. John blinked. Arthur turned. Polly did not move at all. That's a serious accusation, Thomas. It's an observation. Arthur looked between them. Wait, what? Polly unbuttoned her coat, took it off, hung it over the chair opposite Tommy's desk, and only then answered. Yes, she said. I forged it. Arthur swore. John grinned in spite of himself, because there were few things in the world funnier than someone else being the victim of Polly's certainty. Tommy did not smile. Why? Polly looked at the sleeping child. Because that boy was being sent somewhere weak. Weak is safe. No, she said. Weak is where wolves go first. Tommy let the cigarette burn down to the filter between his fingers. Who is he? Polly met his eyes. A child with enemies. That narrows it down in this city to half the streets. He's not from this city. That doesn't improve matters, she nodded toward the scar. I've seen marks like that before, not on skin, on people's lives. Tommy disliked it when Polly spoke like that. He disliked it more when experience taught him she was often right. You brought me an unknown child, he said, in the middle of the night using a forged letter because you had a feeling. No, Polly said. I brought you an opportunity. There it was. Arthur groaned softly. Paul, for God's sake, she turned on him. You think I'm talking about money? I'm talking about survival. A boy that powerful, with enemies we know nothing about, either grows up under someone's hand or he grows up under no one's. Which do you think is safer for him? Which do you think is safer for us? Tommy lit another cigarette. He did not ask how she knew the boy was powerful. Polly knew things. That was different from understanding them and perhaps wiser. What debt do we owe him? Tommy asked. Polly's face shifted just slightly. Not him, his mother. Tommy's attention sharpened. Polly went to the cabinet, poured herself tea as though she had not just delivered an infant into a criminal enterprise, and spoke with maddening calm. 3 years ago, in Cokeworth, one of ours had police on him after a warehouse job went wrong. Young, stupid, bleeding all over the pavement. He'd have been taken. Instead, the constable who cornered him suddenly forgot what street he was on, forgot what he was chasing, walked the wrong direction. Our lad lived. Tommy said nothing. Polly sipped her tea. The girl who did it was called Lily Evans. Red hair, bright eyes, clever, no reason at all to involve herself, but she did. Tommy looked at the baby again, his mother. Yes, and you're sure? I checked before I brought him through that door. Tommy leaned back. He did not believe in sentiment. He believed in balance sheets, leverage, fear, and memory. Debts mattered because men became weak when they ignored them. A favor unpaid did not vanish. It waited. The child slept through all of it. Arthur moved closer, staring down. He doesn't look like trouble. Tommy exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. They never do. Harry's first year in the Shelby house was not soft. It was warm, fed, clothed, and watched, which in small Heath counted as luxury. Polly saw to the practical things first. She found milk that didn't upset his stomach, blankets he wouldn't kick off, a woman 2 streets over who had recently stopped nursing and was willing to help for the right price, and no questions. Arthur tried holding him once and nearly panicked when the child grabbed his finger and refused to let go. John declared him all right because he did not cry much. Tommy said very little at all, but he watched. That was how Tommy Shelby cared for things, by taking note of what could threaten them. Harry grew quickly and oddly. Not odd in any obvious way, he walked on time, talked early, rarely fussed unless hungry or overtired. But by the time he was 2, Tommy noticed that the room changed around the boy. Men who came in angry to demand money somehow lost the sharp edge of it when Harry toddled through with Polly's hand wrapped around his wrist. Dogs that barked at strangers lowered themselves to the floor when Harry looked at them. Once, a glass ashtray began sliding toward the edge of Tommy's desk, all on its own, while Harry glared at Arthur for laughing at him, then stopped dead the instant Tommy noticed it. Tommy said nothing. He said nothing because naming a thing too early gave it power. At 3, Harry learned that silence was information. Tommy found him one evening sitting under the office window while Polly and Arthur argued in the next room, little hands folded in his lap. Head tilted the way old men tilted theirs in pubs when listening for truths hidden under louder truths. "What are you doing?" Tommy asked. Harry looked up, listening. To what? Harry considered the question, which was already irritating. Aunt Pol's angry voice is different from her scared voice. Tommy lit a cigarette. "And which is it now? Scared?" Tommy looked through the half-open door at Polly's profile and knew at once the boy was right. That was the day he started teaching him. Not books first, not numbers, people. He taught him that the first man to speak in a room rarely mattered as much as the man everyone glanced at before answering. He taught him that fear moved faster than anger and made men more honest. He taught him that when someone offered you a deal too quickly, it meant the deal was for them, not for you. Harry listened the way other children breathed. By 4, he could tell when a customer was lying about what he owed before the man had finished the sentence. By 5, Polly was teaching him letters and sums at the kitchen table, and Harry learned numbers the way some boys learned hymns, because they ran the world, whether the world admitted it or not. "Again," Polly said, tapping the ledger. Harry, his dark hair falling into his eyes, read the names aloud without stumbling. "Men, streets, amounts, dates. What is a ledger?" she asked. "A memory," Harry said at once. Polly smiled faintly. "And why do men fear them?" "Because paper remembers after people decide not to." That answer pleased her more than she let show. It also pleased Tommy, though he would sooner have swallowed the cigarette than say so. Arthur's lessons were different. Arthur taught him the body, not violence first. Weight, timing, balance. The shape of a man just before he swung. The difference between someone who wanted to frighten you and someone who actually meant harm. At 6, Harry was still too small to fight, but Arthur had him stand in the yard and learn how to plant his feet. Learn how to take a push without losing the ground under him. "Most people lose before they've even decided to stand," Arthur told him. Harry shoved back at him with all the force in his narrow frame and bounced off Arthur's forearm like a thrown coat. Arthur laughed. Harry did not. "Again," the boy said. Arthur's grin widened. "That's the spirit." John taught him reputation, not the grand kind, the daily kind, the kind that built itself in a street one remembered slight at a time. At 7, Harry came home with a split lip from a schoolboy twice his size. Polly wanted names. Arthur wanted the boy's address. Tommy wanted to know what Harry had done. "Nothing," Harry said. Tommy's eyebrow lifted. Harry wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "He said things about this family." John, lounging by the window, nodded approvingly. "And I hit him." Arthur burst out laughing. Polly muttered something about idiots raising idiots. Tommy crouched in front of Harry until they were eye level. "Did you win?" Harry hesitated. "No." Tommy studied him, then nodded once. "Good." Harry frowned. Tommy stood. "You don't start by winning." You start by making sure the second time costs them more. 2 days later, the older boy apologized in front of half the schoolyard for reasons he could not fully explain. He had arrived to find 3 lads from another street already waiting for him. No one had seen Harry speak to them. No one could prove anything. John only said, "Loyalty shown once, shown publicly. That's how people remember where they stand." Harry remembered. By 8, he had begun reading in Tommy's office when the house slept, not by permission, by ability. He had discovered that the lock on the study door could be lifted with a thin piece of metal and a patience Tommy himself would have approved of. He did not steal. He read. Shipment schedules, supplier names, police payoffs. Notes written in Tommy's narrow hand that said more in 6 words than most men managed in a page. Tommy discovered him one night perched in the leather chair, feet not touching the floor, the big ledger open across his knees. Harry did not flinch. Tommy looked at the lock, then the book, then the boy. "Did you take anything?" "No." "Did you change anything?" "No." Tommy stepped closer. "Then why are you here?" Harry looked down at the page. "Because you keep the truth in this room." Tommy stood very still. Most boys lied when caught. Some ran. Harry had never yet made the mistake of choosing the smaller answer when a larger one might work. Tommy took the ledger from him, closed it, and slid it back onto the desk. "From now on," he said, "you knock." Harry stared up at him, trying to work out whether this meant he was forbidden or promoted. Tommy opened the door. "It's easier to teach someone when I know where they are." That was as close to trust as the house ever heard spoken plainly. The first real sign came in the market. There had been smaller things before. Dice landing the way Harry wanted. A door slamming when he wished it would. A tea kettle whistling the instant Polly muttered she hadn't the patience to wait for it. Small coincidences, if one preferred that word. Tommy did not. He preferred patterns, and by age 8, the pattern around Harry Shelby Potter. Because in Small Heath everyone had begun using both names, whether legally true or not, had become impossible to ignore. It happened on a Thursday in late autumn. The market was loud, wet, and mean in the ordinary way markets were. Men shouting prices, women dragging children by the hand, the smell of cabbage, engine oil, rain, old newspapers, and tobacco. Harry walked beside Tommy with a parcel under one arm and his eyes everywhere. "That one's watching you," Harry said quietly. Tommy did not look. "Which one?" "Blue cap, by the oranges." Tommy kept walking. "And," he looked at your coat first, not your face. Tommy's mouth twitched almost invisibly. A gunman, then. Men checking the coat were checking for shape and draw. "Good," Tommy said. They turned the next row of stalls. Harry had just opened his mouth to say something else when a man stepped out from between 2 carts and caught him by the shoulder. Not hard. Not enough to injure. Enough. Harry froze. The man was smiling the way drunk men smiled when they believed a child was too small to count. "Easy there," he said. "Where you rushin' off to?" Tommy had already turned. The world seemed to narrow. Later, Harry would remember the hand first, thick fingers, the smell of beer, the pressure on his coat. Then the man's face changing, not from confidence to pain, but from confidence to confusion. There was a muffled sound, a gasp, and smoke began curling from the inside of the man's coat. For one impossible second, no one moved. Then fire bloomed under the wool as if someone had lit a newspaper in his lining. The man screamed and stumbled backward, slapping at himself. Fruit crates went over. People shouted. Someone yelled for water. Another yelled witchcraft, though not in the way they meant it at Hogwarts. In Birmingham, it just meant bad luck with a face. Tommy was already between Harry and the crowd, not shielding the crowd from the boy, shielding the boy from the crowd. Arthur would later say that was when it became real for him. Tommy grabbed a wet sack from a stall, threw it over the burning man, and knocked him flat. Steam and smoke rose. The smell was ugly. The shouting spread outward like a dropped stone sending rings through a pond. Harry stood perfectly still. His face had gone white. Tommy looked at him once and saw the truth immediately. The boy had not meant to do it, but he had done it. Tommy's own heartbeat struck once, hard against his ribs. Fear was not unusual. Surprise was not unusual. But there are certain moments in a man's life when the world offers him proof that the rules he has lived by are no longer the only rules in operation. Tommy Shelby hated such moments. He hated them most when they involved children he had allowed under his roof. He put one hand on the back of Harry's neck and steered him away before the crowd could decide on a story. "Don't run," he said. Harry's voice came out thin. "I didn't mean, I know. How did I not hear?" They walked home through rain that seemed suddenly too cold. Tommy said nothing for 3 days. Arthur tried once and was shut down by a look. Polly watched both of them as if waiting for a bomb to choose its timing. Harry, for his part, became quieter. He obeyed. Ate when cold, read when told, did not ask questions aloud. But Tommy could see the tension in him, the way his fingers curled around teacups, the way doors seemed to close harder when he left rooms, the way anger flashed in him and the lamps flickered with it. On the third evening, Tommy found him awake in the kitchen after midnight. A cup of tea steamed untouched in front of the boy. Rain tapped at the glass. Tommy sat opposite him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Tommy took out his cigarettes, thought better of it, and put them away again. "That thing you did," he said. Harry's eyes lifted. In the half-light they looked very green, too young still, too sharp already. "You'll learn to do it on purpose." Harry stared at him, not because the words were comforting. They weren't, because they meant Tommy had already chosen not to fear him. Or, more accurately, had chosen to make fear useful. "Aren't you angry?" Harry asked. Tommy leaned back. "Did you do it because you enjoyed it?" "No." "Did you do it because you wanted him dead?" Harry swallowed. "No, then anger would be a waste of time." Harry looked down at the tea. "I didn't even know I could do that." Tommy's voice remained level. "Most dangerous things don't arrive with introductions." That, Harry would later understand, was one of the truest things Tommy Shelby ever told him. Tommy leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me now. Men like us don't get the luxury of pretending something isn't there because it's inconvenient. You've got a thing inside you. Fine. Then we treat it like any other weapon. We learn its trigger. We learn its range. We learn when to use it and, more important, when not to." Harry's hands tightened around the cup. "What is it?" Tommy considered lying. Polly had already told him enough to know the likely answer was impossible. The letter. Hagrid, Lily Evans. Stories Polly had extracted from frightened little men who worked in frightened little offices of a hidden government no sane person would have believed in if they had not been bribed properly first. Magic. That was the word they used. Tommy did not like the word. It sounded too much like luck. And luck was for fools and bookmakers. Still, he did not give Harry that word, not yet. "It's power," Tommy said instead. "The rest is detail." Harry absorbed that. Tommy could see it happen. That was another thing about the boy. He did not merely hear instruction. He built himself around it. "Can I stop it?" Harry asked. Tommy tilted his head. "Can you stop a gun from firing once the trigger's pulled?" "No." "Then we start earlier than that." From the doorway, Polly watched unnoticed for a long moment. She saw Tommy giving the boy not comfort, but shape. In the Shelby house, that was often the same thing. After that, the training changed. Tommy never called it training. Harry knew enough by then not to require the label. He was told to keep notes, not in obvious language, never that, but in a plain black book Polly gave him with no name on the cover. Weather, mood, what had happened just before. What he had felt in his chest, his hands, behind his eyes. When anger made the lamps flare. When fear made windows frost from the inside. When concentration caused cards on the table to twitch without wind. Polly added her own observations in the margins sometimes, in neat, tight handwriting. "You do better when you know the whole room, worse when cornered. Never test it while tired." Arthur took to pretending none of it disturbed him. This, to be fair, was not entirely a pretense. Arthur accepted the impossible more easily than most, because he had spent years living with things in his own head that felt no less irrational. John, meanwhile, thought it was brilliant. Got a proper secret weapon in the family now. He said once, grinning, until Tommy's expression informed him that the next sentence mattered. John raised both hands. "Right, quiet weapon." Harry learned control in pieces, not elegant pieces. There were no chants, no books of spells, no teacher from the hidden world arriving to explain lineage and theory. There was only a Shelby education, observation, repetition, discipline. When angry, breathe before speaking. When afraid, sit before moving. When the strange pressure started building in his hands, stop looking at the problem and start looking at the room around the problem. It worked often enough to matter. At 9, Harry could make a match flare without touching it if he stared long enough. At 9.5, he shattered a whiskey glass by accident after Arthur came home bleeding. At 10, he stopped a door from opening by wanting it shut so hard that the handle bent in its fittings. Tommy never praised the results directly. He praised the control. That, he said after the bent door, is better. Harry looked at the warped brass. I still lost my temper. Yes, Tommy said, but you lost it at the right target, which was in its way an advancement. The house shifted around him as he grew, not in fear, in accommodation. There was always a place for him at Tommy's desk now, though never in Tommy's chair. Always a file Polly might accidentally leave near the kitchen for him to read and summarize. Always a task John would phrase like a joke and Arthur would phrase like a challenge. He was not coddled. He was included. That was more dangerous, because inclusion was how the Shelbys taught love without ever naming it. One winter evening, just after Harry turned 10, he stood beside Tommy in the study while rain moved over the windows in silver streaks. A ledger lay open between them. Tommy tapped a name near the top. What did you know about him? Harry read once and answered at once. He pays on time when watched and late when not. He owes more to his pride than to us. He lies badly to older men and well to younger ones. He's frightened of court but not of prison, so if you want him obedient you threaten embarrassment, not police. Tommy was silent for a moment. Then, and if he turns, Harry looked up. There was no hesitation in him now when it came to such questions. Not because he was cruel by nature, but because he had been raised among people who considered consequences before morality and survived because of it. You don't make an example of him, Harry said. You make an example of the man who thinks turning is safe after watching him. Tommy's gaze rested on him. The answer was correct, too correct. Somewhere under Tommy's ribs, where old war and older ghosts still lived, something tightened. He had wanted the boy sharp. He had not expected him to become sharp in precisely Tommy's image. Harry turned another page. Why did you keep me? He asked. Tommy lit a cigarette. You've only just thought to ask, I asked Polly. She said you'd answer better. Tommy almost smiled. He looked toward the rain-black glass. Then back to the boy whose hair never sat flat, whose scar had long since become part of the house's ordinary strangeness, whose green eyes carried both questions and calculations at the same time. Because someone owed your mother, Tommy said. Harry absorbed that with visible care. And after that, Tommy exhaled smoke. That was the dangerous question, the one Polly would have avoided and Arthur would have blundered and John would have joked away. Harry had asked it because he wanted the truth, not reassurance. Tommy respected that enough to answer part of it. After that, he said, you were ours. Harry said nothing, but something in his face settled, not with softness, but with certainty. Outside, the rain kept falling over small heath, over brick and gutter and black roads, over bookmakers and back rooms and men who made decisions because they feared what happened when they did not. Inside, in the study where Tommy Shelby kept ledgers, guns, and the truths he preferred locked away, a boy with his mother's eyes stood learning the weight of inheritance. Not magic. Not yet. Something older in its own way. The understanding that power was never a gift. It was a burden you either learned to carry properly or let crush you in public. Harry did not know the name Hogwarts. He did not know what wand would suited him, or what house would one day argue over him, or what prophecy had once narrowed the whole world down to his breathing. He knew ledgers. He knew loyalty. He knew that men who smiled too quickly usually wanted something. He knew that fear, organized properly, could look exactly like respect, and he knew, because Tommy Shelby had looked him in the eye and said it plainly, that whatever strange fire lived under his skin, it was not a thing to hide from, it was a thing to master. far away, beyond Birmingham, beyond the city, beyond everything Harry could yet imagine. A hidden world continued arranging itself around the idea of the boy who lived in Small Heath. That boy sat down at Tommy Shelby's desk, opened the next ledger, and began to read. Chapter 2. The Sorting Problem, Hogwarts, September 1991. The hat spent 4 minutes on his head. It had never taken 4 minutes before. The first letter arrived with the Morning Post and a dead pigeon. The pigeon had not been dead when it entered the Shelby kitchen. Arthur swore as it came through the open window in a blur of gray feathers, clipped the hanging lamp, and landed in the breadbasket in a shower of crumbs and indignity. Polly flinched backward with one hand to her chest. John, who had been reaching for toast, laughed so hard he nearly choked. Harry, halfway through his tea, did not move at all, because tied to the bird's leg with red string was an envelope of heavy yellow parchment. Tommy looked up from the table. The pigeon, owl, Harry corrected automatically in his head, though he had no idea why, stared at all of them with the exhausted resentment of a creature that had flown too far to care about dignity. Then it pecked weakly at the butter dish. Arthur pointed. "That's not natural." "Nothing about this house is natural," Polly said, recovering first. Harry untied the letter. The envelope bore his name in green ink. Mr. Harry Potter, top floor, bedroom, Watery Lane House, Small Heath, Birmingham. Arthur leaned over his shoulder. "Fancy writing." Tommy held out a hand. Harry gave him the envelope unopened. Tommy examined the seal, then the script. He already disliked the look of it. It had the particular confidence of institutions that believed their existence placed them above explanation. He opened it with a letter knife. Polly watched his face as he read, because Tommy Shelby almost never showed surprise, and when he did it mattered. At length he handed the paper to her. Her eyes moved quickly, then she exhaled through her nose. "Well," she said, "it seems they've found us." Harry took the letter next. It was headed with an address in Scotland, a name written in flowing black script, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And beneath it, a formal notice informing him that he had been accepted as a first-year student. Attached was a list of books, robes, equipment, and terms, all written as if the matter had been settled before he was born. Harry read every line once, then twice. The room had gone quiet. Arthur broke first. "Witchcraft!" John took the parchment from Harry and squinted at it. "It says he needs a wand." "A what?" Arthur asked. "A wand." Arthur stared. "What, like a stage magician?" Tommy's cigarette burned untouched between his fingers. Polly set the letter down carefully. "So, it's a school." "It's more than a school," Tommy said. Harry looked at him. "You knew." Tommy met his eyes. "I suspected." "That's not the same." "No," Tommy said. "It's usually safer." Arthur sat heavily. "Hold on, we're saying there's a whole hidden world of what? Wizards, proper ones?" Polly gave him a look. "Do fake ones usually send birds into kitchens?" Arthur considered this. "Fair." Harry picked up the equipment list again. A cauldron, brass scales, glass or crystal files, a wand, school robes, a pointed hat. Textbooks with titles so absurd they could only be real. He did not smile. Harry rarely smiled at new information. He assessed it. "How long have you known?" He asked Tommy. Tommy tapped ash into a tray. "Long enough to know there are people with power who prefer not to be seen by ordinary men. Long enough to know your mother belonged to them. Long enough to know you do too." Harry's gaze dropped back to the page. Belonged. He disliked the word immediately. Polly saw it. "That letter tells you where they expect you to go," she said, "not what you owe them." Tommy stood. "John, find out where this station is." John looked at the letter. "King's Cross, London." Arthur frowned. 9 3/4. There was a silence. Arthur read it again. 9 3/4. John snorted. Polly pinched the bridge of her nose. Tommy said, "Good, then we know what kind of people they are." "What kind?" Harry asked. Tommy folded the letter once and handed it back to him. "The kind who assume the impossible will be accepted if they put it on official paper." That afternoon, 3 more letters arrived, then 7 the next morning, then 12 before lunch. Owls began appearing on the roof, the sill, the chimney, the garden wall. One battered against Tommy's office window until Arthur opened it out of sheer fury. By the third day, the kitchen looked like an aviary run by accountants. Harry sat at the table and read each duplicate letter in silence while Polly kept count. "They're persistent," she said. Tommy watched another bird descend through the rain. "They're annoyed." Harry looked up. "Because I didn't answer." "Because," Tommy said, "they're not used to being ignored." That evening there was a knock at the front door, not a polite one. A knock that suggested the person outside had mistaken courtesy for inefficiency. Arthur opened it with every intention of making that clear, and found himself looking up at a tall woman in emerald robes, so severe they might have been military. She wore square spectacles, a pointed hat, and the expression of someone who had arrived prepared to be disappointed. Which, Arthur would later say, meant she fit the house surprisingly well. "Professor Minerva McGonagall," she said crisply. "I am here for Mr. Harry Potter." Arthur blinked. "You're dressed for the theater." She looked past him into the hall. "No doubt." Tommy appeared before Arthur could answer. For one still moment, the two of them took each other's measure with the instant dislike of people accustomed to being obeyed. Tommy gestured inward. "Come in." She entered without hesitation. Polly came from the kitchen, dried her hands, and gave McGonagall a smile so calm it would have frightened lesser women. Harry stood at the base of the stairs, the newest letter still in his hand. Professor McGonagall's face softened by a fraction when she saw him. "Mr. Potter." Harry said nothing. That, more than any theatrical display of magic, told her something important about the household. Most 11-year-olds would have stared. This one assessed. "I assume," Tommy said, "you're here because the birds failed." Professor McGonagall drew herself up. "I am here because a Hogwarts acceptance is not optional." Tommy lit a cigarette. "Everything is optional." Her mouth thinned. "Not this." Harry spoke before Tommy could. "Why not?" McGonagall turned to him. "Because you are a wizard, Mr. Potter. You require training. Without it, you would be a danger to yourself and those around you." Harry considered that. "That part I believe." Tommy's gaze shifted very slightly toward him. He had expected denial, perhaps irritation, not acceptance. McGonagall set a leather case on the table and opened it. Inside were forms, pamphlets, and a small stack of printed explanations so dry and official they made Tommy suspect instantly that the wizarding world produced civil servants at a rate even worse than Westminster. She explained. There was a hidden society, a governing ministry, a statute of secrecy, magical families and non-magical ones, wand law, school terms, houses, owls, currency, the train. The fact that Harry's parents had both attended Hogwarts, the fact that his mother had been Muggle-born, which Polly found interesting and Tommy found useful. Harry interrupted only when necessary. "How many people know where I live?" McGonagall paused. "Within the magical community, very few. Within the school, a handful. Within the government," she gave him a sharper look now. "Why do you ask?" "Because if there are enemies involved, I'd like to know how many doors they'd have to go through." Tommy looked at Harry once, approvingly. McGonagall noticed. For the first time since entering the house, she began to understand what kind of upbringing this had been, not neglect, not abuse. Something in some ways more formidable, deliberate shaping. "Your safety," she said carefully, "has been under protection for years." Tommy spoke through smoke. "By whom?" McGonagall's jaw tightened just enough for Polly to catch it. "There are people who have taken an interest in Mr. Potter's welfare." Tommy smiled without warmth. "People with names, Professor Dumbledore among them." Tommy looked at Polly, and Polly looked back, and a whole conversation passed silently between them. So, the old man from the forged letter was real after all. Harry took the explanation pamphlet from the table. He did not look at it. "What happens if I say no?" McGonagall stared at him. He held her gaze without blink or fidget. Around them, the kitchen seemed to pause. Tommy waited. Polly waited. Arthur pretended not to be fascinated. John failed at pretending not to be fascinated. Professor McGonagall answered with absolute honesty, perhaps because she suspected this boy would hear dishonesty as easily as most children heard thunder. "You would remain untrained. Your magic would continue to surface unpredictably. The ministry would monitor incidents. Eventually, intervention would become unavoidable." Harry nodded once, not a child's nod, a negotiator's. So it isn't a choice, he said. It's a controlled outcome. McGonagall's eyes sharpened. Tommy exhaled smoke toward the ceiling and said, "Now he's speaking the language." Professor McGonagall looked from one Shelby to the next and understood, belatedly, that this conversation had left ordinary school administration somewhere behind in the first 30 seconds. Harry folded the pamphlet. "If I go," he said, "I want books early. Books. I learn faster when I know the rules before the room changes." McGonagall blinked once. "That can be arranged. I want a full supply list," Harry continued, "and anything you can tell me about the school structure that isn't in the brochure." Tommy said nothing, but Polly had the strong impression he was trying not to look pleased. McGonagall studied Harry for another long beat. Then, unexpectedly, she gave the smallest nod. "That," she said, "can also be arranged." Diagon Alley would have disappointed Harry if Tommy hadn't prepared him for it, not because it was unimpressive. It was the opposite. Hidden behind an ordinary London pub whose customers had mastered the useful art of appearing forgettable, the alley opened like a secret spoken aloud. Crooked shop fronts and stacked windows, brass instruments turning in displays, owls in cages, cauldrons in towers, robes floating on mannequins, snowy parchment signs, polished glass, and the hum of a world that considered itself normal because it had existed long enough to forget how impossible it looked from the outside. Arthur stared openly. John grinned like a man entering a fairground. Polly went still in the way she did when cataloging opportunities. Tommy merely took it in. Harry, walking half a pace behind him, watched the people. That was the first thing Tommy noticed and the one that mattered most. Harry's attention did not remain on the spectacle. It moved to patterns. Who deferred to whom? Who wore money quietly and who wore it loudly? Which shopkeepers watched passers-by as customers and which watched them as prey? Which families moved with ownership and which with caution? Good, Tommy thought. Let the rest of it sparkle. The real business is always underneath. They went first to Gringotts because McGonagall had insisted and because, as Tommy privately admitted, one did not ignore buildings that looked that well fortified. White stone. Bronze doors, goblins in stiff uniforms and sharper expressions. The place felt less like a bank and more like a warning shaped into architecture. Harry liked it immediately. The account manager who received them had narrow hands, unreadable eyes, and the exact tone of someone forced by policy to tolerate human beings in measured quantities. His name, according to the desk plaque, was Ragnock Vale. He reviewed Harry's papers with precise disdain. Then he paused, his eyes lifted to Harry, then to Tommy, then back again. "Curious," he murmured. Tommy's cigarette remained unlit out of respect for the premises, and because he suspected the goblin might charge a fee for ash. "What is?" Ragnock folded the documents. "Most first access visits involve guardians dazzled by inheritance and children too young to understand numbers. This appears to be neither." Harry looked at the vault key. "What do I inherit?" Ragnock's mouth shifted by perhaps a millimeter. A goblin smile, Tommy guessed, meaning either approval or a future knife. "Several family holdings," he said. "Trust assets, a primary school vault. Certain dormant claims attached to the Potter and Evans lines, nothing extraordinary by old standards, considerable by current ones," Tommy said. "And who has visibility on those holdings?" Ragnock's gaze rested on him now. "That is an intelligent question," Tommy answered with silence. Ragnock's fingers tapped the paperwork. "Gringotts has visibility. Certain authorized ministry departments have limited visibility where law requires. Outside inquiries are possible but not encouraged." "Can authorization be changed?" Harry asked. Ragnock looked at him more carefully. "It can," the goblin said, "with proper signatures, identity verification, and the absence of coercion." Tommy glanced at Harry. Harry did not look back. Good, it was already beginning. He was testing the walls. They rode the cart down into the earth. Arthur yelled once on a turn so sharp it nearly took his soul with it. John laughed himself breathless. Polly looked pale but refused to admit it. Tommy kept one hand braced and one eye on Harry, who was memorizing the route even though the twists made that impossible. At the vault, gold and silver gleamed from the stone like a dragon's bad habit. Arthur whistled. John said, "All right then." Polly's expression tightened into calculation, not greed. Inventory. Harry stepped inside and looked around once, not dazzled, not thrilled, assessing. "How much of this is liquid?" he asked. Arthur turned. "He's 11, Tommy said. "No, he's mine." Ragnock answered the question. By the time they left, Harry knew the rough size of his available funds, the name of the manager overseeing the family accounts, and 3 regulations regarding trust access that most wizarding children would not learn until adulthood. Tommy, meanwhile, had learned something else. The goblins respected directness. They were not charmed by prestige. They noticed leverage. And when Harry asked if Gringotts maintained historical records of disputes involving old land transfers, Ragnock had gone very still before saying, "On a paid basis." Tommy filed that away under future. They bought the school things after that. Robes at Madame Malkin's, where Harry stood motionless on a fitting stool while another boy with pale hair and an expensive voice tried to establish social dominance by talking too much. Draco Malfoy, he said his name was, as though the surname alone should have done the work. Harry learned 3 things in under 2 minutes. First, Draco was used to being agreed with. Second, Draco measured people by bloodline because it was the only scale on which he had never had to compete honestly. Third, Draco wanted Harry's approval almost at once, though he did not know it yet. "You'll want to know the right people before term starts," Draco said. Harry met his eyes in the mirror. "Will I?" Draco hesitated, "just enough. My father says. Most boys your age begin their sentences with 'I think,'" Harry said mildly. "It's a stronger habit." Draco flushed. Madame Malkin pretended not to hear. Polly, seated near the window, very much did hear and looked pleasantly unsurprised. "Outside the shop?" Tommy asked. "Well," Harry adjusted a sleeve. "Useful for now." Tommy nodded once. "And later?" Harry's face did not change. "Liability." Tommy lit a cigarette and did not hide the faint satisfaction in his eyes quickly enough for Polly to miss it. The wand shop came last. Ollivander's was narrow, dusty, and full of the kind of silence old places, where when they know other people need them more than they need other people. The old man behind the counter had pale eyes and fingers like roots. "Ah," he said softly, as if Harry were a thought returning after a long delay. "Mr. Potter." Tommy disliked him immediately because he was the first person all day who had looked at Harry as destiny rather than person. Wands came and went. Holly, maple, ash, cedar, some did nothing, some sparked. One cracked a vase. Harry's patience remained steady. Tommy approved of that too. At last Ollivander placed a slender wand of dark, polished wood in Harry's hand. "You," he murmured. 11 inches, phoenix feather." Unyielding, Harry took it. For one suspended second, the whole shop seemed to draw breath. Warmth ran up his fingers. Light spilled through the dusty air in a thin, golden arc. Boxes rattled quietly on their shelves. Somewhere above them glass chimed. Ollivander smiled in the way priests smile at fulfillment. Tommy only looked at Harry, not at the wand. At the boy, Harry's face had gone very still. "What does it mean?" he asked. Ollivander's voice lowered. "That the wand has chosen." Harry looked down at the yew wood in his hand. It did not feel like choosing. It felt like recognition. And Harry, being Harry, distrusted recognition on sight. The summer before Hogwarts passed under study. Harry read Hogwarts, a history twice and a third time in pieces. He drew maps from memory. He copied school rules into a notebook, then added probable gaps in enforcement beside them. He learned the names of all 4 houses, the broad reputations attached to each, the hierarchy of teachers, prefects, head boy, head girl, caretaker, governors. He learned the names of founding families. He learned that old institutions ran on myth in public and admin in private. Tommy found him 3 weeks before term with parchment spread across the office floor. "What's this?" Harry pointed with the end of a pencil. "Access." "To what?" Everything. Tommy looked down. The pages were covered in names, families, known ministry positions, school affiliations. Notes written in Harry's narrow hand. Abraxas Malfoy, former governor connections. Augusta Longbottom, old money, old pride, grandson likely under pressure. Weasley, many children, low cash, high network density. Dumbledore, central node, authority informal and formal both. Tommy bent, picked up one page and read it twice. "Where did you get this?" "Books," Harry said. "And the clerk Polly found." Polly in the doorway said, "Disgraced ministry clerks are the most useful kind. They've usually kept copies." Tommy set the paper down. "Why are you doing this?" Harry answered without looking up. "Because when I get there, everyone else will have been born knowing what matters. I haven't." Tommy watched him a moment, then, "And," Harry's pencil paused, "and because schools aren't really about lessons." Tommy's mouth twitched. "No. They're about future loyalties." Tommy looked at Polly. Polly lifted one shoulder. "He listens." Tommy crouched and tapped the page listing houses. "You think they'll put you where?" Harry considered. "Slytherin." Arthur, coming in behind Polly with a drink in hand, barked a laugh. "Based on what?" Harry looked up. "On the descriptions they gave of ambition, cunning, self-preservation, resource management, strategic patience, and dislike of losing." Arthur opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Tommy. Tommy said, "Fair." "But," Harry added, "I'm not sure that would be best." Tommy's gaze sharpened. "Why not?" "Because everyone would expect it." Polly smiled then, slow and fox-like. There it was, the real answer. Harry had not learned merely to understand systems. He had learned to position against expectations. "Good," Tommy said. "Always enter a room through the door. They've forgotten to watch." King's Cross was louder than Birmingham and no more honest. Steam, shouting porters, newspaper boys, businessmen, mothers, trunks, whistles, boots on stone. The kind of movement that made most people look straight ahead and miss everything. Harry did not. He walked beside Tommy with a caged owl, snowy, furious, expensive, under one arm, and his school trunk being dragged by Arthur with theatrical complaint. Polly had named the Owl Duchess because the bird looked like she disapproved of poor people. Arthur called her Knife because she had already tried to remove one of his fingers. Harry called her nothing yet. Names mattered. He was still deciding. Platform 9 was simple enough. Platform 10 stood right beside it. Families moved between them, porters shouted, children cried. No sign of three-quarters of anything. Arthur scratched his head. "Maybe it's underground." "It's not underground," Harry said. "How do you know?" "Because if they'd hidden it underground, the directions would be smug in a different way." Tommy almost smiled. Then Harry saw them. A red-haired family moving with just slightly too much confidence toward a solid barrier between platforms. The mother talking briskly, the older children laughing, the youngest boy pale with nerves. "Those are ours," Harry said quietly. Tommy followed his gaze. "How do you know?" "They're not looking for it." "Good," Tommy thought again. "Go on then," he said. Harry took his trolley, set his jaw, and walked straight at the barrier. For one absurd heartbeat, every part of him expected pain. Then stone became motion, noise became steam, and the hidden platform opened around him in a burst of scarlet engine. Owls, families, trunks, and children in black robes. He turned almost at once, watching the barrier as Tommy, Polly, Arthur, and John came through in sequence, each pretending they had not just walked through solid architecture. Arthur looked back once and said, very quietly, "I hate it." Polly ignored him. The train was already breathing white steam into the air. Students hurried. Parents called last warnings. An old woman sold sweets from a trolley farther down the platform. Near the front, a cluster of adults were staring at Harry with the discreet failure of people trying not to stare. He noticed. He noticed all of it. Tommy adjusted Harry's collar once, no embrace, no speech, just learn the terrain before you move on it. Harry nodded. Polly stepped in next and straightened the edge of his robe. Right regularly, Arthur grinned and thumped his shoulder a little too hard. "If anybody gives you trouble, hit first." "Arthur," Polly snapped. "What? It's practical." John leaned down. "Find out who matters before they know you're looking." Harry looked at each of them in turn, then at Tommy. Tommy held his gaze and said the one thing that mattered most. Do not let them tell you who you are just because they have categories ready. For the first time that morning, something in Harry's chest shifted, not fear, not exactly. The awareness that he was walking into a world that had known his name before he knew its doors, and that the people who had raised him had just handed him the only defense they believed in, himself. He boarded the train. He did not look back immediately. That was another Tommy lesson. Never turn at the threshold. Choose your moment. He chose it at the compartment window. The Shelbys stood on the platform in a crooked line that would have looked ridiculous to anyone else and looked, to Harry, like structure itself. Polly upright and dark-eyed, Arthur waving too early, John with his hands in his pockets. Tommy still as stone, cigarette between his fingers, eyes on the train. Harry lifted one hand. Tommy gave the smallest nod. Then the train moved. The journey to Hogwarts began with observation. Harry walked the corridor before choosing a compartment. He noted who sat where, who clustered by confidence and who by habit, which children had trunks worn with use and which had new brass corners polished to shine. He passed Draco Malfoy holding court in one carriage, already arranging himself as though the year required a prince. Harry kept walking. He selected an empty compartment near the middle and took the seat with the best angle on the corridor door. 10 minutes later, a round-faced boy opened it halfway, looking flustered. "Sorry," he said. "Have you seen a toad?" Harry looked up from the school map in his lap. "No," the boy nodded miserably and started to close the door. "Wait," Harry said. The boy stopped. "You've asked 14 compartments on this side and 9 on the other. If the animal isn't dead, stolen, or under a seat, it'll move toward warmth or noise. Search the luggage racks near the engine end. Less draft." The boy blinked. "Oh!" Harry held his gaze for half a beat longer. "And don't apologize before people tell you no." The boy looked startled, then thoughtful. "Right, thanks." He left. Harry returned to the map. 3 minutes later, the compartment door opened again and a red-haired boy stood there, ears pink, dragging a trunk that looked like it had lost fights with all available corners of the world. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Mind if I—" Harry glanced past him. Not entirely true. 2 compartments remained with space, but both contained older boys who looked as if they found first years entertaining only when crying. He also noted the hand-me-down robe, the patched trunk, the sandwich wrapped in newspaper, the family resemblance to the platform woman, and the expression of someone trying not to look poor in public. Institutional knowledge, Harry thought. He closed the map. "Sit down." The boy did, awkwardly grateful in a way Harry mistrusted less than smooth confidence. "I'm Ron," he said after a moment. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter." Ron stared. There it was. Recognition, fame, something between disbelief and excitement. Harry watched it happen and disliked it at once. "You can say it," he said. Ron blinked. "Say what?" "That you know the name." Ron flushed harder. "Well, yeah, of course I do." Harry looked back out the window. "That makes one of us." To Ron's credit, he laughed instead of getting defensive. "My brothers would have killed to be in here first." He admitted. "That would have complicated the seating," Harry said. Ron laughed again, more easily this time. Useful, Harry thought. Loyal-looking, speaks before refining. Family saturated in this world. Good, the trolley which came. Ron turned pink over his sandwich. Harry bought more than he could eat and pushed half the lot across without comment. Ron stared, then took one chocolate frog with the reverence of a religious experience. By the time the train had cleared the city properly, Harry knew the order of Ron's siblings, which teachers' older children feared most, that wizard suites were designed by lunatics, and that Ron carried shame over things he had not chosen. Noted. The Toad Boy returned eventually, toadless, with a girl behind him whose hair looked as though rules slid off it by instinct. She took in the suites, the owl, the map, and the boys in one sweeping glance. "Has either of you seen a toad?" she asked. "No," Ron said. Harry said, "Probably near the engine end by now." She nodded once, accepting competence without fuss. "I'm Hermione Granger," she said. "And if either of you are planning to test spells before we arrive, at least open the window first." One of the boys, 2 compartments down, nearly set his sleeve on fire. Ron muttered, "How do you know that?" I looked. Then she looked at Harry's map. "That's not from the school list." "No. Where did you get it?" Harry met her eyes, brown, bright, direct. No inherited deference, no interest in pretending not to ask. A source? She stared at him for a second, then to Harry's surprise smiled very slightly. "All right," she said. "Keep your secrets." She turned to go. "Hermione," Harry said. She paused. "If you wanted the real answer, you should have asked who made the copy, not where I got it." For the first time, she looked genuinely interested. Then she left. Ron let out a breath. "She's terrifying." Harry looked at the corridor she'd disappeared into. "No," he said. "She's useful." Hogwarts at night looked exactly like a place built by people who considered restraint a character flaw. The castle rose over the lake in lit towers and stone, all impossible edges and black water and reflected gold. First years crowded in boats, staring, some with awe, some with fear. Harry stared too, but in a different way. Entrances. Height, windows, sightlines. Old structures always had forgotten passages because old power liked private movement. The great hall was larger than it needed to be and therefore political, ceiling like the night sky. House tables. Teachers raised on a dais. Candles floating overhead with the kind of extravagance that told Harry the school valued symbolism more than budgets. He felt eyes on him before they entered fully. By the time Professor McGonagall arranged the first years into a line, half the hall knew who he was. Or thought they did. Harry kept his face neutral. McGonagall gave the speech about houses, points, loyalty, glory, the usual institutional theater. Harry listened because Tommy had taught him something simple. When people explain their system proudly, listen hardest to what they assume needs no defense. Then the hat was brought out. An old pointed thing patched and frayed, and when it opened a stitched mouth and began to sing, Harry understood immediately why Arthur had hated Platform 9 3/4. Wizarding people had no instinct at all for easing others into madness. Names were called. Students sorted. Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Slytherin, Gryffindor, Neville Longbottom. The toad boy nearly fell onto the stool. The hat barely touched him. Gryffindor. Relief shook through the hall around him. Interesting. Draco Malfoy strode up with a confidence that made clear he had been sorted in his own head years ago. Slytherin. Applause from the green and silver table. Smugness from Draco before he'd even sat down. Then, Potter, Harry. The hall changed. Even the candles seemed to go quieter. Harry walked forward, aware now of the watching not as pressure but as data. Expectation in the room. Curiosity. Fear. Hero worship from some. Contempt from others. Calculation from several teachers. Dumbledore watched him over half-moon spectacles with a brightness Harry mistrusted instantly. Snape, dark and still, watched him like a private grievance given human shape. Good, Harry thought. Honest faces are rare. Honest hostility is rarer. He sat. The hat came down over his eyes. For a second there was only cloth and old dust. Then a voice, dry as parchment and far too close to his thoughts, said, "Well." Harry did not flinch outwardly. "You're loud in interesting places," the hat said, "and very quiet in others. You sort everyone this slowly." Harry thought back. The hat gave the mental equivalent of a snort, deflection, control, pattern recognition, suspicion of authority, ambition, certainly, cunning, yes, loyalty, but not to institutions, protective instincts hidden under transactional language. A talent for compartmentalization unusual in one so young. Harry waited. Slytherin would be obvious, the hat mused. You would thrive there. More than thrive, I think. You would have half that table running errands by Christmas and 3 bloodlines in your debt by Easter. Harry considered that. Efficient, dangerous, the hat corrected. To whom? That apparently was the correct question. The hat was silent for several seconds. You are not a boy who believes in belonging for its own sake. Houses are meant to shape, but you would treat one as territory. Slytherin would sharpen what is already sharp. Ravenclaw would bore you once you mastered its vanity. Hufflepuff would dislike how easily you weaponize patience, and Gryffindor, the hat's voice turned thoughtful, you do not have their kind of bravery, then why consider it? Because you have another kind. The ugly kind. The kind that walks into impossible rooms because a calculation says the room must be crossed. The kind that burns reputation, comfort, even affection if the objective requires it. Harry said nothing. The hat pressed deeper. And because if I place you in Slytherin, the school changes around you too quickly. Too much consolidates. Too soon. There it was, not a judgment of character, a judgment of effect. Harry almost admired it. You're afraid of efficiency, he thought. I am old enough to know what concentrated power looks like in schools, the hat replied sharply. Then, softer, and there is this too. You want access to Dumbledore. You want the center, not the basement. You want to be underestimated by the people who prefer simple categories. Harry did not answer because there was no need to. The hat had found him correctly. Very well then, it said. It shouted to the whole Gryffindor. Noise crashed over him as the hat lifted away. Applause. Surprise, relief in some corners, disappointment in others. Draco Malfoy's face from across the room, genuine shock. Dumbledore's expression unreadable and therefore noted. Snape looking displeased in a way Harry suspected had little to do with houses. Harry went to the Gryffindor table and sat between Neville and Ron as though the moment had not contained anything extraordinary at all. Ron hissed, "Blimey." Harry poured water into his goblet. "About what?" "You," Ron said. "Malfoy looked like he'd swallowed a bee." Harry took a drink. "Good." Across the hall, Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor too, after a longer pause than most but shorter than Harry's. She sat down 3 places away, looked once at him, and did not ask. Better. The feast began. Harry listened more than he spoke. By the end of the first night, he knew which Gryffindors valued courage because they had it, and which because they wished they did. He knew Percy Weasley liked rules because they gave hierarchy a script. He knew the twins weaponized chaos, but with selective targets. He knew Neville expected failure before attempting anything, and that this expectation enraged Harry more than it should have. Most of all, he knew the castle was now his problem, and, potentially, his. The first month at Hogwarts confirmed nearly everything Harry had expected and improved on it in several ways. The classes mattered less than the spaces between them. Teachers taught theory, wandwork, procedure, history, etiquette. Harry learned quickly, but he did not treat lessons as ends in themselves. They were pieces, tools. The true school existed in corridors, common rooms, libraries, side conversations, who sat beside whom at meals, who copied whose homework, who feared which prefect, who borrowed money, who owed favors, who needed something they could not ask for publicly. Harry began with information because information scaled. It started small. A Hufflepuff second year wanted to know whether a Slytherin boy had really written to his father about a broom purchase before the term ended. Harry found out he had not. Fee, 1 silver sickle. A Ravenclaw girl wanted to know which corridor Filch checked least after curfew. Harry confirmed a pattern from 4 nights of observation. Fee, 2 chocolate frogs and a favor later. 3 first years wanted to know which professors could be approached after class and which interpreted questions as challenges to authority. Harry gave them the correct answers. No charge. Investment. He kept notes in a plain ledger hidden under a loose floorboard in the dormitory. Written in a shorthand no one else could have followed even if they had found it. Ron noticed first that Harry was never surprised by events other people considered sudden. "How did you know McLaggen was going to get caught sneaking back from the kitchens?" he asked one night. Harry looked up from his reading. "Because he's arrogant and hungry. Those are predictable traits." Ron stared at him. "That's not normal." Harry turned a page. "A lot of what passes for surprise is just other people failing to look." Ron shook his head, half admiring, half bewildered. Neville entered the operation without realizing it at first. He was not recruited because he was weak. Harry had stopped thinking in those terms years ago. Neville was recruited because he endured embarrassment with a kind of stubborn shame that did not become cruelty. Because he had been failing publicly for years and still came back the next morning to try again. Because, as Tommy had once told Harry about certain men in Birmingham, The ones who look soft under ordinary pressure often turn hardest when something truly matters. The opportunity came over a second year named Bletchley, who had made sport of Neville for 3 weeks running. Harry did not confront him. That would have been emotional and therefore inefficient. Instead, Harry learned Bletchley's habits, his preferred seat in the common room, his vanity about dueling, his tendency to copy Charm's work from a Ravenclaw boy who resented him. Then Harry arranged, with 2 whispered remarks and 1 misdirected timetable, for Bletchley to swagger into an empty classroom expecting a private practice session and instead meet a very irritable Professor Snape, who had been anonymously informed that someone was brewing an unauthorized mixture in there after hours. Bletchley lost 50 points and 3 months of social confidence. Neville never knew exactly how it happened, but he noticed it stopped. Later, much later, Harry would tell him the truth. At 11, he only said, when Neville thanked the room in general one evening for the quiet, "People stop when the cost changes." Neville looked at him oddly, as if sensing something under the sentence he could not yet name. Hermione was last because Harry left the hardest negotiations for when he understood the board. She, too, had been studying the school. But unlike Harry, she treated mastery as a moral act. Learn enough, work enough, get enough right, and the world ought to respond with order. Harry admired the effort and distrusted the premise. Their first real conversation happened in the library after she caught him reading a restricted index he definitely had not been given permission to access. "You moved the ladder," she said quietly. Harry did not look up. "And yet here we both are. That section's not for first years. Most useful sections rarely are." Hermione set down her stack of books. "You always talk like you're 40. Harry closed the index. "Only when people ask ordinary questions about unusual behavior." She folded her arms. "Fine. Unusual question. What exactly are you doing?" Harry considered lying, then decided not to. That, more than anything, was why Hermione Granger became part of his inner circle, because she was the first person at Hogwarts to whom honesty offered better odds than manipulation. "I'm building an information network," he said. She blinked once. "You're what?" "I'm learning who knows what, who needs what, who can be trusted to deliver messages accurately, who folds under pressure, who overstates, who listens better than they speak, and which parts of the school operate outside official supervision." Hermione stared. For a moment, Harry thought he might finally have said something sufficient to drive someone away. Then she asked, very carefully, "Why?" "Because territory must be understood before it is defended. Because power hates vacuums. Because hidden things are safer when they're yours." He answered with the part she would accept first. "Because every major problem in this school seems likely to arrive wearing mystery," he said. "And I dislike being the last person to know I'm already involved." Hermione was silent. Then she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat. "That," she said, "is the most alarming thing anyone our age has ever said to me." Harry nodded. "Do you want in?" She stared at him another second. Then, before he had finished the breath after the question, said, "Yes." There it was, no performance, no bargaining, recognition. Harry respected it immediately. By November, the 3 of them, Ron, Neville, Hermione, and Harry, occupied the same corners often enough for the castle to begin forming opinions. Ron assumed he'd stumbled into a friendship. Neville hoped he had. Hermione knew better and didn't seem to mind. Harry called none of it friendship yet, not even in his own head. But when Ron was late to breakfast once, and Harry found himself irritated rather than merely alert, he made a private note that the line had begun to blur. The room of requirement came to him by instinct first, then by proof. He had noticed gaps in the 7th-floor corridor traffic, students who seemed to appear from nowhere. Whispers about a place where lost things turned up or rules thinned at the edges. One older Hufflepuff swore she'd found a quiet room there before exams with all the books she needed already on the shelves. Another had sobbed to a friend that she'd hidden there for 3 hours after a row and nobody had found her. Harry did not believe in rumors. He believed rumors indicated concealed infrastructure. So he tested the corridor. 3 nights in a row after curfew. under the invisibility cloak his father had left him, and which Harry had accepted with outward calm and inward suspicion, he paced before the blank stretch of wall near the tapestry of a foolish man teaching trolls ballet. He tried with clear needs. A place to hide, a place to read, a place to think. Nothing on the fourth night he changed method, not want, function. I need a room no professor can enter, he thought, a place to organize information, a headquarters. He walked past the wall once, twice, 3 times. A door appeared. Harry stopped. The castle, he thought, is listening. Inside was a room neither grand nor modest, but exactly correct. A long central table. Shelves, 2 high-backed chairs, cabinets, a fireplace laid ready, a ledger on the table blank and waiting, a great board on the wall that could take pins and notes. Windows that did not look outside but gave the impression of distance anyway. Harry stood in the doorway for a long time, then he went in, shut the door, and smiled for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, not from wonder, from acquisition. He brought the others in separately at first. Ron's jaw dropped. Neville looked as if the room might apologize to him for existing. Hermione turned in a slow circle and then went straight to the shelves to see if the books were real. "They're real," she said a moment later, voice tight with delight. "Of course they are," Harry replied. "Of course they are," Ron said. "Of course they are." Harry laid a blank ledger on the table. "This is ours." "Ours for what?" Neville asked. Harry looked at each of them in turn for operations. Ron laughed because he thought it was a joke. Hermione did not laugh because she understood it wasn't. Neville looked mildly alarmed and, for reasons Harry appreciated, did not leave. The network formalized there. Harry handled intake and final decisions. Hermione verified information, cross-checked facts, built systems for cataloging rumors by confidence level, and improved Harry's crude indexing within 2 days to something approaching weaponized scholarship. Ron handled movement without noticing at first that he had become essential. He knew people, not in the aristocratic sense as Draco did, but in the human sense. Dormitory moods, Quidditch chatter, which older siblings had said what over summer, which family stories were exaggerated and which weren't. He was the network's bloodstream before Harry had even named the role. Neville watched and listened and remembered odd things. More than odd things, important things that other people discarded because they came from quiet corners. A teacher muttering to himself. A passage draft. A plant in an abandoned corridor. A hinge that squealed every third opening and therefore warned of approach. Neville noticed infrastructure. Harry gave each of them work before they knew enough to object. By the 3rd week of using the room, small commerce had begun. A 4th-year Slytherin paid for confirmation that a professor had indeed received an owl from his father after a disastrous potions mark. A Ravenclaw paid for the answer key pattern to Binns's essay prompts. Not the answers themselves, just the pattern, which was worth more. A pair of 2nd-year Gryffindors paid Harry to tell them whether Filch could detect mud on shoes better than he could detect dung bomb smoke. He gave the correct answer, took a cut, and added the result to Hermione's index. "Are we blackmailing people?" Ron asked one evening. "No," Harry said. "Feels a bit like blackmailing people." "Blackmail requires leverage through fear," Hermione said without looking up from the ledger. "This is information brokerage." Ron stared at her. That sounded worse. Harry rested a hand on the back of a chair and looked at the map slowly taking shape on the board. Names, arrows, schedules, favors owed, confidence marks. No professors knew, no prefects knew, no student yet understood how large it might become. Harry did. He also knew something else now. Hogwarts was not merely a school. It was a city wearing educational robes. A city with old wealth, old grudges, forgotten passages, arrogant officials, frightened children, careless families, and power moving under the stone like underground water. Small Heath had taught him what to do with places like that. At the end of November, Harry remained alone in the room of requirement after the others had gone. Firelight moved over the ledger. The castle beyond the walls breathed in distant pipes and sleeping corridors. Somewhere far below, the giant squid turned in the lake, though Harry had never seen it and doubted half the stories about it were true. He opened the ledger to the first page and wrote, in neat, black ink, "Territory is not what you own. It is what you understand before anyone else does." Then he closed the book. Outside, Hogwarts glittered with candles and old myths and the confidence of a place that believed itself eternal. Inside the hidden room, Harry Potter, raised by the Peaky blinders, trained to read power before language, and now armed with a wand, a map, and a growing network, began quietly to build his first real enterprise. And elsewhere in the castle, older dangers were already waking. He just didn't know their shape yet, not fully. But when they came, they would not find a lost boy waiting. They would find an operator. Chapter 3. By order of the Shelby Company, years 2 and 3, the Empire expands. Dumbledore watched the boy and thought, this is not a student. This is a negotiation. Harry spent the summer after first year in Small Heath with a notebook full of names and a new habit of silence, not the silence of sulking, not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of someone rearranging the world in his head. Tommy noticed it first on the train back from London. Arthur talked the whole way home, half amazed by the castle and half insulted by it. John wanted details about the staircases, the ghosts, the food, the Quidditch, and whether the old families looked as insufferable as they sounded. Polly wanted facts, the headmaster, the teachers, the families, the structure of authority, what the ministry's reach seemed to be, what the newspapers said, and what the school believed. Harry answered every question clearly, then he went quiet again. By the time they reached Watery Lane, Tommy knew what that quiet meant. It meant Harry had reached the point where information was becoming strategy. That first night back, Tommy found him in the study with his Hogwarts notes spread across the desk beside the Birmingham ledgers, comparing them as if they belonged to the same world. In some ways, Tommy thought they did. Harry did not look up when Tommy entered. The school runs on old names. He said. Tommy lit a cigarette. So does England. It also runs on blind spots, Harry went on, pencil moving over a page. Everyone knows who has status. Very few know who actually moves outcomes. Tommy came to stand behind him. On the page, Harry had drawn 3 columns. Official power, practical power, hidden power under official power, Dumbledore, ministry, heads of house, governors, prefects under practical power, older students, wealthy families, Quidditch captains, school rumor lines, house loyalties under hidden power, house elves, ghosts, library access, the room. Gringotts, fear. Tommy read the list once and said, good. Harry glanced up. Good. Tommy exhaled smoke toward the dark window. Most people see only one layer. Clever people see 2. If you can keep all 3 in your head at once, you don't get surprised as often. Harry considered that, then nodded once, as if filing it into the part of him that never wasted usable instruction. Tommy tapped the page with hidden power. What's Gringotts doing here? Harry's pencil paused. They don't trust the ministry. No one with money ever should. They also remember debts longer than wizards do. That made Tommy still slightly. He looked at Harry more carefully. You're thinking about them already. Harry met his eyes. I'm thinking about everyone already. Tommy's mouth twitched in the nearest thing he gave to approval. Good, he said. Then start with the ones who take insult seriously. Those people are easiest to predict. Second year announced itself not with politics or mystery, but with insult. The insult came in the form of Dobby the house elf demolishing a pudding, getting Harry blamed, then trying to stop him returning to Hogwarts at all. By the time Harry, Ron, and the Weasley twins had extracted him from his locked bedroom at Privet Drive in the Flying Ford, Anglia, Harry had already reached 2 conclusions. First, someone in the hidden world was frightened enough of his presence at Hogwarts to interfere directly. Second, the method of interference was sloppy. Tommy had once told him that panic always left fingerprints. Harry had not understood at the time how broadly that rule applied. Now he did. The flying car incident, the broken barrier, the Whomping Willow, the detention, all of it should have embarrassed him. Instead, it irritated him, because none of it had been random. Someone had acted early and badly, which meant they either lacked reach or had been forced to move before ready. Interesting, At the welcoming feast, Harry's eyes moved through the hall the way they had the year before, only sharper now. Draco Malfoy looked too pleased with himself, which usually meant he knew something he should not. Snape looked at Harry with his usual private contempt, and something else beneath it this time. Alertness. Professor Lockhart, glittering and useless at the staff table, radiated the sort of confidence Harry had seen in bookmakers right before bankruptcy. And Dumbledore watched the room as if listening to music no one else could hear. Harry disliked that immediately. The first message appeared on Halloween. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Most of the school responded with fear. Harry responded with administrative annoyance. A cat had been petrified. A message had been left. Panic would rise. Movement patterns would change. Patrols would increase. Rumors would multiply beyond useful density. An unknown actor had begun operating within the castle using symbolic violence. In other words, someone had started doing business on Harry's territory without permission. Ron stared at the words on the wall and whispered, "Harry." Harry didn't take his eyes off the scene. "HM, this is bad." "Yes, you don't sound scared." Harry turned slightly. "I sound busy." Hermione gave him a sharp look, because she understood exactly what that meant. By midnight, the room of requirement had become a war room. The board on the wall had been cleared and reorganized. Hermione listed attacks, victims, timelines, staff responses, known legends about the chamber, and probable misinformation streams. Ron tracked house chatter. Neville, unexpectedly excellent at noticing what frightened people did to corridors and common routes, marked traffic changes. Harry stood at the center table with the message copied neatly onto parchment, examining it as if it were an invoice from a rival firm. "Let's start simple," Hermione said. "Who benefits?" "Not enough," Harry replied. Ron frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means this is ideology, not profit." "Which makes it worse." Neville swallowed. "Because ideological people are mad." "No," Harry said. "Because they'll absorb losses businessmen wouldn't." Hermione nodded grimly. "Pure-blood supremacist language, air enemies, it's signaling." Harry's gaze remained on the copied message. "Yes, but badly." Ron blinked. "Badly." Harry looked at him. "If you're trying to consolidate fear, you either strike fast and invisibly until the institution looks weak, or you strike publicly enough that everyone knows who to submit to. This does neither. One victim. One message. No claim of demands. No follow-through." Hermione stared at him. "You make it sound like extortion." Harry met her eyes. "Most political violence is." That silenced the room for a beat. Then Hermione said quietly, "All right, so what does that tell us?" Harry set the parchment down. "That whoever opened it wants terror, not control, which means they are either stupid, young, or not the one truly directing it." Ron groaned. "Brilliant, that's comforting." Harry ignored him and turned to the board. "We map every story about the chamber, every family connected to it, every student bragging too loudly about blood purity, every staff member acting under briefings they didn't admit receiving, and every physical access point beneath the school we can verify." Neville raised a hand slightly, as if still unsure he was allowed to. Harry looked at him. "There's a pipe in the second-floor girls' bathroom," Neville said. "The old one with Myrtle. It rattles at odd times even when nobody's around." Hermione frowned. "How do you know that?" Neville flushed. "Plants. There are some in the corridor outside. They don't like the draft." Harry's eyes sharpened. Noted, he thought. There it was again. Neville never noticed what people valued, but he noticed what structures did. Tommy would have liked that. The investigation widened. Harry did not fight duels the way Hogwarts expected. He learned the formal work, because one learns systems before bending them, but his practical method had already become something else. In class, he was competent, occasionally careless-looking by design, allowing others, especially Draco, to mistake the edges of his ability. In situations that mattered, he moved differently. No wasted motion, no decorative spellwork. Target the wrist, the footing, the line of sight, the escape route. Use surprise. End the threat fast. Never let an audience see the full inventory. Lupin would later name it for what it was. But during second year, most teachers only sensed that Harry fought wrong, and some of them, secretly, thought that wrong looked effective. By Christmas, the school had split itself into frightened camps. Hufflepuffs whispered that Harry might be the heir because strange things followed him. Slytherins, especially the crueler ones, found the whole spectacle intoxicating. Gryffindor resented the suspicion but had no coherent answer. Dumbledore remained watchful. McGonagall became brisker, which was her way of being worried. Snape watched Harry more than before, though whether out of distrust or concern Harry could not yet tell. He filed that uncertainty under irritating. The breakthrough came from Hermione, as most useful breakthroughs did. She placed a stack of books on the room table and said, "It's a basilisk." Ron recoiled. "A what?" "A giant serpent," Hermione said. "Created through dark means, its direct gaze kills, indirect gaze petrifies." Harry absorbed the facts almost at once. Means of movement. Pipes, if the legends are right. Control method, she hesitated. Parseltongue, probably. Ron turned to Harry. "That's snake language, right?" Harry said nothing. Because at the dueling club, he had told a snake to leave Justin Finch-Fletchley alone, and the snake had obeyed. And afterward, every face in the room had looked at him not with gratitude, but with the ugly shock of old superstitions finding a living shape. Harry disliked superstition because it made people lazy, but he disliked its effects even more. Hermione read his silence correctly and did not push. Instead, she said, "If it's a basilisk, then the chamber isn't a metaphor, it's a physical site, which means it can be found." Harry nodded. "And trapped." Ron looked between them. "Trapped," Harry turned to the map. "If it moves through the pipes, it has routes. If it has routes, it has patterns. If it has patterns, it can be baited." The plan took 6 days. That was what separated Harry from most boys his age and, increasingly, from many adults. He understood that success often came from treating extraordinary threats with ordinary discipline. Day 1, confirm likely route access. Neville and Hermione mapped bathroom plumbing from building schematics. Harry coaxed from the room itself. Ron collected rumors about hearing voices near walls. Harry noted every attack location and overlaid them. Day 2, test response times of staff to corridor disturbances. 2 anonymous incidents involving loud bangs and 1 mysteriously flooded stairwell gave them timing windows. Day 3, secure mirrors. That part required brokerage. Harry quietly acquired 3 hand mirrors from vain Ravenclaws, 1 polished serving tray from the kitchens through Dobby's increasingly frantic assistance, and 2 shielded display panes from an abandoned classroom. He did not explain the full purpose to anyone outside the core group. Day 4, confirm the entrance. Myrtle, insulted by being asked direct questions by everyone except Harry, accidentally gave Hermione enough to identify the sync mechanism. Day 5. Stage false movement rumors on the opposite side of the school to dilute staff traffic. Day 6. Descend. Harry stood before the opened pipe entrance with the invisibility cloak folded over one arm and a knife in his boot, because magic was excellent but steel was honest. Ron looked pale. Hermione looked furious with fear, which in her case resembled determination sharpened into a weapon. Neville gripped his wand too tightly but did not step back. "You don't all have to come," Harry said. Ron answered at once. "Shut up," Hermione said. "Obviously we're coming." Neville swallowed and added, "We've already done the map." Harry looked at them in turn. Something in him, something Tommy had not placed there, though Tommy had helped define it, tightened and steadied. "Fine," he said. "Then we do it properly. No heroics. No improvising unless the plan breaks. Hermione, call positions. Ron, mirror line and extraction if we lose sight. Neville, rear coverage and signal on sound movement. Nobody looks directly at anything large, scaled, and murderous." Ron said weakly, "Wonderful." They went down. The Chamber of Secrets was not theatrical in the way the Great Hall was theatrical. It was the opposite. Old, damp, vast, and built by someone who believed intimidation worked best in silence. Stone snake carvings, wet floors, darkness that seemed to have substance. Harry hated it immediately, not because it frightened him, because it had been allowed to exist under the school for centuries without anyone decisive enough to clear it. At the final chamber, Tom Riddle appeared out of memory and diary ink, handsome in the thin way of preserved arrogance. Ginny lay pale and still. The diary pulsed at the base of the statue. Harry listened to Riddle talk because men like that always told on themselves if given enough room. Tommy had taught him that vanity was often just confession in slow dress. By the time the basilisk emerged, Harry already knew two things. Riddle needed spectacle, and he believed Harry was still functioning like a schoolboy. That error cost him. The basilisk lunged. Fangs, scale, force. The mirrors mattered instantly. Ron and Hermione shifted the angles exactly as planned, preventing a direct line for several critical seconds. Neville shouted warning on the ricochet of sound off stone. Harry vanished under the invisibility cloak long enough to alter the serpent's strike line, forcing it to follow scent and movement instead of clean sight. The sword of Gryffindor came when Harry needed it because Hogwarts liked myths. But it was not the sword alone that won. It was preparation. Harry drove the basilisk toward the mirrored choke point they had selected earlier from the chamber layout. Hermione shouted distances. Ron slid one of the polished trays under the beast's striking path, shifting its head a vital few inches. Neville, white-faced but steady, sent sparks into the far wall to force it to turn. Harry struck once with the sword, deep enough to wound but not finish. Then, when the serpent twisted around the pillar and opened its jaw for the killing rush, Harry stepped inside the angle, drew the knife from his boot, and buried it hard through already torn flesh beneath the lower jaw where scale gave way. Not because the knife was stronger than magic. Because steel, used at the right moment, did not argue with theory, the basilisk convulsed, slammed stone. Fell, Riddle's expression for the first time lost its certainty. Good, Harry thought. He took the basilisk fang, crossed to the diary, and drove it through the page spine while Riddle still believed he might have time to talk. The memory tore itself apart with a scream like paper discovering blood. Ginny breathed. The chamber quieted. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Ron said, voice cracking slightly, "You stabbed a 1,000-year-old monster with a knife." Harry, breathing hard, wiped serpent blood from his hand. It was already wounded. Hermione let out one sharp, almost hysterical laugh. Neville sat down very abruptly on a stone step. When Dumbledore found them later, the story the school received was a cleaner version. Brave students, an ancient chamber, a basilisk destroyed, Ginny saved, house points, relief, applause. The truth stayed in the room, not because Harry wanted glory hidden, because he wanted methods hidden. Dumbledore, however, was too observant to miss certain patterns. A day after the chamber closed, he called Harry to his office. The room smelled of parchment and secrets. Portraits dozed in frames. Fawkes watched from his perch with an intelligence Harry disliked, slightly less than human versions. Dumbledore sat behind the desk with his hands folded, not smiling. That, the headmaster said gently, was not how most second years would have approached a basilisk. Harry remained standing. No, Dumbledore's blue eyes rested on him. You brought a team, used misdirection, prepositioned reflective surfaces, treated a legendary threat as an operational problem. Harry said nothing. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened just a little. You remind me at times of people far older than yourself. Most institutions, Harry replied, prefer children surprised by danger. It makes them easier to protect badly. For the first time in the conversation, Dumbledore looked genuinely taken aback. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. This is not a student, he murmured, almost to himself. This is a negotiation. Harry heard it and chose not to react. That was another Shelby lesson. When someone important accidentally tells the truth, let it remain theirs. Second year ended in applause and rumors. Third year began with a prison break. Sirius Black's escape hit Hogwarts like a whispered bomb. Teachers stiffened. Parents wrote frantic letters. The ministry sent dementors. The Daily Prophet fed on panic with its usual appetite for exaggeration sharpened by just enough truth to do real harm. Harry read every article twice. Then he wrote to Polly. The letter was colder than his age should have allowed. He asked why no one had told him he had a godfather. He asked why this information had been withheld. He asked whether Sirius Black had truly betrayed his parents or whether the official story merely had the convenience of official stories. Polly read the letter at the kitchen table in Small Heath and exhaled through her nose. Tommy, smoking by the window, watched her expression. "He's angry," she said. Tommy held out a hand. She gave him the page. He read it once. There was no wasted language in it, no self-pity. Just the particular severity of someone who had realized an absence of knowledge had limited his options for years. Tommy reached for a pen and wrote back only one line. "He's learning." When Harry received the reply at breakfast, Hermione asked, "That's it?" Harry folded the note once and put it away. "Yes." Ron leaned over. "What does it mean?" Harry looked toward the gray sky outside the enchanted ceiling. "It means they think I'm asking the right question." The Dementors proved different from anything Harry had yet faced because they attacked not his body or position, but the architecture of the mind itself. On the train to Hogwarts, when the compartment door slid open and cold poured in before the creature even entered, Harry felt something inside him drop like a floor collapsing, not fear. Worse, loss without name. Loneliness stripped of thought. The sense that every hard thing endured had been endured for nothing. He heard a woman scream. He did not know then that it was his mother, only that the sound lodged in him like shrapnel. When he woke later with chocolate in his hand and Professor Lupin studying him in quiet concern, Harry already hated the creatures absolutely. Lupin interested him at once, not because the man was kind, though he was, not because he taught well, though he did, but because he watched students the way men watched weather at sea. Not just what they said, but what condition they were in saying it. By October, Lupin had formed his own view of Harry Potter. He saw the restraint in class, the calculated imperfection in public duels, the way Harry never showed full speed twice the same way, the way he positioned himself between weaker students and danger without ever making a performance of it, the way, during one Bogart lesson, Harry's fear became not a visible monster, but a pressure in the room that suggested something colder and more internal than a child ought to carry. After a defense session in which Harry disarmed a fourth year with an efficiency almost offensively plain, Lupin called him back. "You're not learning to defend yourself," Lupin said quietly once the classroom emptied. Harry met his eyes. "No," Lupin folded his arms, "you're learning to win." Harry considered denial. It felt pointless. "Yes," he said. Lupin's face did not harden. If anything, it saddened. "That's a costly education for someone so young." Harry thought of Small Heath, of ledgers, of smoke, of Tommy saying men like us don't get the luxury of pretending something isn't there because it's inconvenient. "Yes," he said again. That evening Lupin wrote Dumbledore a short note. "He's not learning to defend himself. He's learning to win." Dumbledore read it twice and placed it under a paperweight without comment. Harry's war with the Dementors forced him into the Patronus, and the Patronus forced something honest out of him. Lupin expected a stag once Harry finally managed full corporeal form. Or perhaps, knowing James Potter, he feared one. Instead, silver light exploded from Harry's wand in a violent sweep, and took the shape of a peregrine falcon, lean, sharp-winged, cutting the air like a thrown blade. Lupin stared. The bird circled once, radiant and predatory, then struck through the classroom shadows so fast they broke apart before reaching Harry at all. Not a stag, Lupin thought. Not a symbol of inheritance. A hunter from above. When Harry lowered his wand, breathing hard, Lupin said before he could stop himself, "That suits you." Harry wiped sweat from his temple. "Does it?" Lupin almost smiled. "You like position, you prefer the decisive angle, and you strike before others realize the attack has begun." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then, "You knew my father," Lupin's expression shifted. "Yes." Harry said nothing else, but that single answer rearranged several pieces on the board. The truth about Sirius arrived in fragments. Peter Pettigrew, the night his parents died. The lie at the center of the official narrative. Scabbers in Ron's hand, Shrieking Shack, Snape, Lupin, Sirius himself, all of it came together with the chaotic speed of reality asserting itself over bureaucratic convenience. Sirius Black, gaunt and feral with prison and grief, looked less like a killer than like a man who had been left too long without a reason to remain human. Harry assessed him in under 30 seconds. Asset, he thought, high volatility, high value, deep damage, potential loyalty if given structure. Sirius, meanwhile, stared at Harry with something like pain made visible. "You look like him," Sirius said hoarsely. Harry's voice remained level. "I've been told," not coldness, control. There, in the wreckage of 13 years of lies, Harry did not run to him, did not cry, did not collapse into the fantasy of family restored. Tommy had raised him too well or too badly for that. Instead, Harry asked questions, precise ones. "Why didn't you contact me sooner? Who knew the truth? Who had the most to gain from the lie surviving? What access do you still have outside formal institutions?" Lupin watched the exchange in increasing astonishment. Sirius, to his credit, answered. Later, after Pettigrew escaped and the night had collapsed into failure dressed as survival, Harry found Sirius in the hospital wing during the brief moment before flight became necessary. "You're leaving," Harry said. Sirius nodded. "For now." Harry studied him. Sirius looked like a man hanging over an abyss by memory alone. Tommy had once told Harry the most valuable thing you could offer a broken man was not sympathy. Sympathy made men feel seen. Purpose made them useful, and usefulness gave them a reason to stay standing. Harry spoke carefully. "I need someone outside the school," he said. "Someone with connections the ministry can't track properly. Someone who knows old families, old routes, and how the order thinks when it's frightened." Sirius blinked. Harry continued, "If you want to be in my life, be useful in it." The words were brutal enough that Hermione, had she heard them, would have winced. But Sirius did not. Sirius went very still. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed once, ragged, disbelieving, almost relieved. "Your godfather," he said quietly, "has been offered a position." Harry inclined his head slightly. "Temporary contract." Sirius smiled for the first time like a man, not a wound. "By order of the Shelby Company, then." Harry's expression barely shifted, but Sirius saw it. And understood, perhaps before Harry did, that the boy in front of him had been raised not by softness, but by structure. Not by sentiment, but by a code severe enough to function even after trust was broken. That summer, before third year fully closed, Harry took the train not straight home but through London on a detour arranged under perfectly legal circumstances and several very illegal ones. Gringotts received him in a private office, not the main hall. Ragnarok Vale waited with the same polished discourtesy as before. "You are early for a school-age account review," the goblin said. Harry sat. "This isn't a review." "No." Harry placed a folded parchment on the desk. It contained 3 old land grievance cases involving pure-blood families, 2 unresolved collateral disputes, and a note on historical ministry interference in goblin claims. Information Hermione had researched. Polly had cross-referenced through ministry sources. And Tommy had ordered structured into a useful offer. "You have grievances," Harry said. "They have debt. The ministry has blind spots. I'm interested in the blind spots." Ragnarok did not touch the paper immediately. "Why?" he asked. "Would a third-year wizard concern himself with goblin memory?" Harry's face remained still. "Because wizards treat you like a bank and then act surprised when you understand assets better than they do." The goblin's eyes narrowed, not in anger, Harry thought, but in focus. "And what do you want?" "A line of intelligence," Harry said. "Quietly, family pressures. Asset movements. Which old houses are overextended, which are cash-rich and credibility-poor, which are using public neutrality to hide private exposure." Ragnarok's fingers rested lightly on the parchment now. "And what do you offer in return?" Harry did not smile. "What all useful alliances begin with," he said. "Respect, discretion, and opportunities to collect what others assume will never be called in." For a long moment the goblin said nothing. Then, very carefully, he took the parchment. An arrangement was not declared. Wizards like declarations. Goblins liked terms. Harry liked results, so they spoke in specifics until both sides knew exactly where ambiguity remained and why. When Harry rose to leave, Ragnar said, "You are not old enough to be speaking like this." Harry paused at the door. "In Birmingham," he said. "That's never stopped anyone worth worrying about." Outside, Diagon Alley moved in bright summer business. Families bought quills and cauldrons. Children tugged robes. Ministry clerks hurried under paperwork and heat. Nobody looking at Harry Potter that afternoon would have known he had just taken his first real step into an intelligence arrangement the ministry itself could not see. That was fine. Harry had learned long ago that the most important growth in any empire happened where applause could not reach it. By the end of third year, the difference between Harry and the rest of his generation had become difficult for perceptive adults to ignore. He was not merely talented. Talent could be flattered, trained, redirected. Harry was integrating worlds, magic and street logic, wandwork and leverage, school ties and debt economics, institutional knowledge and criminal discipline. He fought with spells when spells were fastest and without them when they weren't. He built alliances with people others ignored. He did not worship power. He sorted it, used it, stored it, measured its cost. Lupin saw it and worried. Snape saw it and resented the parts of it that looked like James while recognizing, with deeper alarm, the parts that looked like something else entirely. Dumbledore saw it and, for perhaps the first time, confronted the possibility that the child prophecy had marked was not becoming a hero in the shape the world expected. Harry, meanwhile, returned to Small Heath for the summer with a falcon patronus, a godfather on the run, a hidden room in a castle, a goblin contact, and a network in 3 houses of Hogwarts already beginning to think in terms he had taught them. Tommy met him at the station. No embrace. No fuss. Just one glance, sharp and measuring as ever. "You've changed," Tommy said as they walked. Harry adjusted his grip on his trunk. "Yes, for better." Harry looked at the black Birmingham sky beyond the station roof and thought of serpents in pipes, diary ghosts, silver falcons, shattered lies, and the way broken men stood straighter when handed purpose. Then he looked back at Tommy. "For scale," he said. Tommy's mouth twitched. That was answer enough. Chapter 4. The hostile takeover years 4 and 5, the ministry problem. They called it a dark mark. Harry called it a competitor's brand. The summer before 4th year began in a field full of smoke, gambling, and national pride weaponized into entertainment. The Quidditch World Cup should have been simple, in Harry's experience. Anything that powerful people called simple usually meant large enough to hide problems inside. Tommy had taught him that the bigger the event, the easier it became for danger to move wearing ceremony. Weddings, races, political dinners, funerals. If enough people were looking in the same direction, something important was always happening just behind their shoulder. So when Harry walked the campsite with Ron, Hermione, and the Weasley family, he admired the scale of it only for about 10 seconds. Then he began doing what Tommy had always trained him to do in crowds. He watched for structure, ministry officials pretending to be relaxed while checking sightlines, family groups clustering by class and bloodline even while pretending everyone was there for sport, foreign delegations measuring British wizarding habits with quiet disdain, vendors pricing aggressively toward wealthy accents, security disguised as cheerfulness. He noticed, too, how badly the ministry managed prestige. They had assembled thousands of witches and wizards from across Europe, built a temporary city, staffed it with functionaries, and somehow still gave the impression that none of the men in charge trusted the system they themselves had made. Rules posted everywhere. Enforcement inconsistent. Too much dependence on authority, not enough on design. Harry filed that under weakness. Hermione noticed him noticing. "You're doing it again," she said as they crossed between tents. "Doing what?" "Looking at everything as if you're going to buy it, steal it, or burn it." Harry glanced at her. "Only the parts badly run." Ron, carrying a paper bag of sweets already half empty, snorted. "You really can't come anywhere normally, can you?" Harry looked toward a row of ministry tents where one official was arguing with another while trying not to seem argumentative in public. "No," he said, "and I don't think normal survives events this size." That night proved him right. The attack came after the match, when celebration had loosened the crowd and darkness gave permission to cowards, shouting first, then running, then green fire overhead and figures in masks moving through the camps with the confidence of men who believed fear itself would clear a path. Death Eaters. Harry had heard the name before, but seeing them in motion clarified something books never did. They were not merely criminals or zealots. They were a brand, theater dressed as terror, expensive robes, anonymous masks, symbolic cruelty. They wanted witnesses. They wanted people talking afterward. They wanted every frightened family to feel the same lesson pressed into the shape of memory. We can still arrive anywhere. Around him, families scattered, children screamed, tents burned. The ministry responded with the kind of panic that came from institutions used to paperwork, not pressure. Harry's wand was already in his hand, not because he planned to duel masked adults in a campsite full of civilians, because chaos required grip. "Ron," he said, voice level even over the noise. "Take Ginny and move left toward the tree line. Hermione, count heads and keep the younger ones together. No one runs alone." Ron snapped into motion. Hermione was already moving before he finished. "Good." Arthur and Bill were herding people, Mr. Weasley shouting instructions, Fred and George doing surprisingly well at being useful under pressure, Percy less so. The twins would later mock him for that until the end of time. Then the dark mark rose, green, huge, glowing over the trees like a threat written for the sky itself. Gasps rippled through the camp. Even the Death Eaters seemed to recoil for one disordered second, because symbols did strange things to the men who believed in them. Harry stared at the skull and serpent overhead and felt not fear, but contempt. Competitor's brand, he thought. That was what made Voldemort different from ordinary tyrants. He understood spectacle. He understood that power displayed without restraint infected the imagination faster than power merely used. Tommy Shelby built reputations in streets and pubs and racecourses. Voldemort built them in legend and death, and marks burned into the sky. Different scale. Same principle. The realization did not comfort Harry. It clarified the shape of the war to come. When Hogwarts announced the Triwizard Tournament, most students reacted with excitement. Harry reacted with suspicion, not to the tournament itself. Institutions loved spectacle and competition, and Hogwarts had already proven it would place children in danger if enough tradition were painted over the problem. No, Harry distrusted the timing. The World Cup attack had shown movement in the old networks. Ministry confidence had been publicly damaged. Fear had re-entered circulation. And now the school intended to host an international event that would gather political families, foreign delegations, press attention, and elite students in one place. Tommy would have called it an irresistible target. By then, Harry had developed the habit of writing to Birmingham in codes that looked absurdly harmless if intercepted. Horse racing metaphors, shipping schedules, betting language, Polly read them like scripture. Tommy answered with the kind of brutal clarity no one else in Harry's life ever used. When Harry sent a letter outlining the tournament, its risks, and the possibility that visibility itself might be the point, Tommy's reply came back in under a week. If they build a stage, assume someone intends to use it. If you can't avoid the stage, own the audience. Harry folded the note and placed it in the inner pocket of his robes. That was the framework. He did not expect his own name to come out of the goblet. When it did, the great hall exploded into noise, and Harry felt something cold settle into place inside him. Not shock. Position. He rose to his feet slowly, every instinct already sorting the room. Dumbledore, startled but not convincingly enough. McGonagall, furious. Snape, deeply suspicious. Karkaroff, calculating. Madame Maxime, controlled anger. Cedric, confusion, then dignity. The students, astonishment, jealousy, excitement, resentment, fear, depending on house and loyalties. And in all that noise, Harry's first real thought was simple. Someone had forced him onto the stage, therefore the stage itself could be used back. He slept little that night. Not because he was frightened, though parts of him were. Because by midnight, the room of requirement had become active again, not as a student headquarters now, but as a campaign office. Hermione paced with a stack of rulebooks and ministry summaries. Ron, still angry, still wounded, still half convinced Harry had somehow done this without telling him, sat in stony silence by the fire. Neville stood at the board adding names. Harry wrote on parchment, then crossed things out, then rewrote them more clearly. "Say it." Hermione snapped finally, turning on Ron. Ron crossed his arms. "You could have told us." Harry didn't look up. "I didn't enter," Ron laughed bitterly, "and somehow your name just walked itself in." Harry raised his eyes then, very calm. "Yes," he said, "which is why this is a problem." Ron faltered, because Harry's face held none of the giddy pride a lying boy would wear. Only concentration sharpened into irritation. Hermione stepped in before the silence turned stupid. "Who benefits?" she asked. "Depends," Harry said. "If the goal is killing me, the tasks provide cover. If the goal is discrediting the school, they provide spectacle. If the goal is positioning me in public as something specific, hero, pawn, symbol, victim, then this is a controlled narrative attack." Neville frowned. "Can it be all of those?" Harry looked at him. "Yes." That room went still. Ron's anger, to his credit, began to lose ground against the larger shape of the thing. That had always been Ron's strength. He could be emotional, impulsive, stubborn. But when the line between personal hurt and actual danger became clear, his loyalties moved fast. He leaned forward. "All right then, what do we do?" Harry turned a page in the notebook. "We compete." Hermione stared at him. "That's it! We compete," Harry repeated. "We win and we control as much of the story around it as possible." Ron said, "That sounds like something Tommy would say." Harry met his eyes. "Yes." And that was that. The first task should have been a dragon fight. Harry made it a logistics problem. As soon as Hagrid let slip enough to confirm the nature of the challenge, Harry did not waste time fantasizing about glorious combat. Dragons were large, angry, heavily protected, and owned the sky. The goal was not killing the dragon. The goal was retrieving the egg. Therefore, the dragon itself was a piece of weather. He spent 3 days studying the keeper rotations. That was what separated him from most Hogwarts students and many of its staff. When presented with danger, he looked not first at the danger itself, but at the structure surrounding it. Feed times. Handler confidence, blind spots in the enclosure. Which dragons reacted most aggressively to horizontal movement. Which keepers got bored. Which turned their backs a fraction too long when speaking to one another. Hermione helped chart it. Neville, who had an odd instinct for creatures, and the people who handled them, noticed that one specific keeper always checked the chains twice on the Hungarian horntail before backing away. Ron complained the whole time and still took notes. On the morning of the task, Harry stood in the tent listening to the roar of the crowd beyond the entrance canvas and felt the old Shelby instinct settle into full alignment. Public spectacle. Controlled risk. A crowd primed for narrative, fine, give them efficiency instead. When his turn came, he walked into the arena not with bravado, but with timing already measured in his head. He had seen the dragon once up close, enough to know where not to be. Enough to know the keepers had left one side of the enclosure with slightly poorer visual coverage because the rock outcrop blocked a clean line. He began with distraction, not assault. 2 fast conjunctivitis hexes, not to blind permanently, just irritate and force head movement. The dragon reared. Harry moved left, not backward. That mattered. Most competitors yielded ground. Yielding made prey. The crowd expected a duel. Harry gave them geometry. He cut across the enclosure's least guarded angle, used a burst of speed rather than prolonged evasion, forced the horntail to pivot around its own clutch, and in that half-second of awkward repositioning, snatched the golden egg. Total time, under 4 minutes. He did not look dramatic doing it. Which was precisely why everyone remembered it afterward. Cedric's task had courage. Fleur's had grace. Crumb's had force. Harry's had the unsettling clarity of someone treating a dragon as merely the largest obstacle in a room. In the stands, Dumbledore watched the boy exit the arena and thought, with growing unease, that Harry had begun approaching every institutional challenge the same way. Identify the emotional story everyone else is telling themselves, then refuse to play by it. The press, of course, loved it. By evening, the conversation across the school had begun shifting. Harry was not just the boy who lived anymore. He was something more complicated, dangerous in a less mythic and more practical sense. Draco Malfoy, who had spent weeks enjoying the attention Harry's forced participation generated, now looked annoyed in a way Harry found quietly satisfying. That night, another coded letter went to Birmingham. First race rigged. Won anyway. Crowd more useful than expected. Opposition still unseen. Tommy's answer came back 2 days later. Winning on a bad field is still winning. Watch who approaches after success. They're often more important than the ones who attacked first. Harry did exactly that. Neutral families began sending subtle signals. A nod too respectful at Hogsmeade. A parent's letter copied to a child with careful phrasing. A Slytherin older brother suddenly willing to trade information without the usual contempt surcharge. People were not aligning with Harry openly, but they were revising their risk assessments around him. That, Harry knew, was how real shifts began. The second task rewarded preparation even more brutally. Once Harry learned the champions would have to retrieve something important from the lake, he did not waste time on panic over drowning. He assigned the problem correctly: underwater duration, navigation, interference, retrieval. Gillyweed came through Neville, though not by accident and not exactly by luck. Harry had already cultivated the Longbottom line of trust carefully, never by condescension and never by forcing Neville into public roles he didn't want. People mistook Neville's hesitance for passivity. Harry had long since recognized it as damaged courage, which was a different material entirely. When Neville quietly put the gillyweed on the room table and said, "This should work better than bubblehead charms at that depth," Harry did not overpraise him. He only nodded once and said, "Good. Add the dosage notes." Neville went pink with pride anyway. Hermione, meanwhile, solved navigation. The lake, in her view, was not a monster-haunted abyss, but an orienteering problem in bad visibility. She adapted a Muggle directional method into a charm sequence that, while imperfect, let Harry correct heading by current drift and magnetic variation. She looked absurdly pleased with herself when the trial model in an enchanted basin worked. Ron stared at the tiny floating marker spinning toward a pin. "That's cheating." Hermione looked offended. "That's maths," Harry said. "In my experience, the two are often confused by institutions." Ron rolled his eyes. "You and Tommy say institutions like normal people say rats." Harry considered. "Rats are often more honest." The task itself passed with less drama than the crowd wanted and more discipline than the judges expected. Harry entered the lake with gillyweed, directional charm, and a timing plan written out the night before. When Grindylows tried to slow him, he did not engage longer than necessary. When Crumb's shark-headed form thrashed through weeds nearby, Harry adjusted course rather than competing directly. Retrieve. Confirm. Exit. That was the sequence. He brought Ron back, because Ron had been taken as what Harry would miss most. That realization embarrassed both of them afterward, and neither of them handled it gracefully. Ron's first words on surfacing were, "You look awful." Harry, choking lake water, answered, "You look worse." Hermione, from the bank, laughed in relief hard enough to nearly cry. The crowd loved that too. Harry noticed something else. Every task he completed increased not only his visibility, but his perceived competence under pressure. That altered future interactions. Teachers watched him differently. Older students recalibrated. Even the champions adjusted around him. Cedric became openly respectful. Fleur stopped underestimating him. Crumb, quiet, direct, not prone to wasted speech, regarded Harry with the sort of athlete's acknowledgement reserved for rivals who made hard things look controlled. That was good. Competence built reputational credit faster than inherited fame, and Harry intended to spend that credit. The maze was where most boys would have made the fatal mistake. The Triwizard Maze invited heroism, dark hedges, hidden threats, shifting pathways, isolation. It was designed to make champions feel as if victory emerged from personal courage and improvisation. Harry knew better. Mazes were lies told by architects. Before the third task, he and Hermione built directional redundancies based on the movement patterns of earlier magical hedge growth observed in class. Neville checked plant behaviors that might indicate external manipulation. Ron, against all personal expectations and with much complaining, helped Harry rehearse movement decisions under timed conditions in the room of requirement. When the task began, Harry entered the maze with the strange calm of someone who had already walked it a dozen times in abstraction. Blast-ended scroots, missed enchantments, false routes, none of it mattered as much as rhythm, move, assess, correct, conserve force, never chase noise. Cedric crossed paths with him once near a split corridor. "You all right?" Cedric asked. Harry gave the briefest nod. "Don't trust straight lines in here," Cedric blinked. "Right." He took the advice. That later would matter more to Harry than he admitted. The cup itself came too easily. That was the warning. Objects of value never sat undefended in places built to test worthy claimants. Not unless the object was no longer the true prize. Harry knew it half a second before he touched it. Not enough time. The portkey yanked him and Cedric from the maze and slammed them into graveyard earth under a cold sky and old stone. The first thing Harry registered was location. Enclosed. Ritual. Not random. The second was that Cedric was still breathing beside him. The third was that the task had been bait all along. Then the night unfolded with brutal speed, Wormtail. The cauldron, Voldemort's return in flesh. Death Eaters gathering in masks like carrion birds called to a field. Cedric dead before the full shape of the trap even finished arriving. That part would stay with Harry in a place deeper than anger. Because Cedric had not died through miscalculation or cowardice or personal flaw. He had died because other men needed theater. Voldemort, reborn and terrible and almost elegant in his cruelty, believed the moment belonged to him completely. He was wrong, not in power. Not there. Harry knew the gap in force instantly and honestly. This was no duel he could win in direct contest. Tommy had taught him that, too. There were fights you entered to dominate and fights you entered to survive long enough to change later, so Harry survived strategically. While Voldemort monologued for the audience he required, Harry listened. Names, voices, habits, wand hands, hesitations. Who moved close? Who stayed back? Who showed zeal and who showed fear? He locked as much of it away as possible while terror and grief hammered at the edges of his focus. When the duel came, it came as spectacle for Voldemort and as timing for Harry. He did not think in terms of triumph. He thought in terms of exits, prior incantatem, ghosts, confusion. The graveyard tearing open in a different direction than Voldemort intended. Harry took Cedric's body because leaving him was impossible on a level deeper than planning. There were some Shelby codes Tommy never stated formally because the family breathed them already. You do not leave your own on the field if retrieval is possible. Cedric, at that moment, had become his. So Harry grabbed the cup, dragged the body with him, and came back through chaos to Hogwarts grass in front of screaming spectators and a world not yet aware it had just changed. Shock should have broken him. Instead, it clarified him. That first night after the graveyard, while adults argued over truth, denial, control, and scandal, Harry did the one thing Tommy Shelby would have done before sleeping, grieving, or speaking publicly. He built the file. Hermione was there. Ron, too, pale and angry and no longer remotely childish in the face of what they'd seen. Sirius arrived as soon as he could. The room of requirement held them all in lamplight, while the castle beyond pretended the ordinary order of school still existed. Harry stood at the table and began dictating. "Lucius Malfoy," he said. Present, front rank, right side, Hermione wrote, McNair, Avery, Crabbe, Goyle, not, I think, voice match uncertain, Karkaroff not present, important, means prior fracture of fear, Ron stared. You're making a list. Harry didn't stop. Yes. Sirius, leaning against the wall in dog form before shifting back, watched with something like grim recognition. Harry continued naming everyone he could remember. Posture. Masks. Who answered fastest? Who hesitated when Voldemort spoke? Who sounded committed? Who sounded trapped? By the time he finished, 3 copies existed. Hermione sealed one for Gringotts under private hold. Sirius took one for external security. The third Harry prepared to send to Birmingham by coded chain. Ron finally said what all of them were thinking. You're doing this now. Harry looked up. Yes. You should be. Ron stopped because he did not have a word big enough. Harry's gaze flicked once toward Cedric's memory hanging over all of them. If we wait, he said quietly, other people begin editing. That silenced the room. Hermione lowered her pen. She understood. Of all of them, perhaps she understood best. Grief could be lived later. Facts, if not pinned down early, got stolen by narratives. Sirius was the one who spoke next. Tommy would approve. Harry's jaw moved once, almost invisibly. That's not why I'm doing it. No, Sirius said. It isn't. Which was exactly why Tommy would. By morning, Harry had an intelligence picture. Not complete, not enough. But enough to start building around. Voldemort had returned. His inner circle had answered. The Ministry would deny it because denial preserved the current arrangement of power. Therefore, denial itself became an exploitable weakness. Harry understood that before Fudge did. He understood it before Dumbledore admitted he did. A minister in denial was not an obstacle. He was a target environment. 5th year was war by paperwork. Most students experienced Dolores Umbridge as a tyrant in pink. Harry experienced her first as a ministry instrument designed by frightened men who preferred humiliation to open force. Her methods were obvious. Audit the school, control speech. Isolate Dumbledore. Discredit Harry. Reduce defense education to text without practical preparation. Make procedure itself into a weapon. Tommy Shelby had met people like her all his life. The type changed accent and clothes, but never bones. Harry knew from her first lesson that she would not be removed by outrage. Outrage fed bureaucrats. It let them claim order was needed because people were emotional. No, Umbridge would need to be disassembled, slowly, quietly. With documents. Before that, though, Harry built Dumbledore's army. He did not call it an army because the name amused him, though it did. He called it that because naming things correctly mattered. A study group was for exams. This was for conflict. In the Hog's Head, amid goat smell and bad lighting and everyone pretending not to be afraid, Hermione did the recruiting on the moral level. Ron handled personal reassurance, and Harry closed the deal. Not with rhetoric, with clarity. The Ministry is not preparing you, he said to the gathered students. That means one of two things. Either they're fools or they know more than they admit and prefer you helpless. I don't especially care which. The result is the same. Cho Chang watched him intently, Ginny with fierce approval, Neville with quiet steadiness. Luna, disturbingly serene, as if this all confirmed things she had already suspected about reality. If you're here, Harry continued, it can't be because this sounds exciting. It isn't. This is work. Repetition. Risk. If anyone wants stories to tell later, leave now. If you want to know how to stay standing when someone actually tries to hurt you, stay. Nobody left. That mattered to Harry more than applause would have. The room of requirement, once a headquarters for school intelligence, evolved again. It became a training facility. Targets. Dummies. Obstacle space. Notes pinned in Hermione's neat hand. Rosters organized by Ron. Observational corrections from Neville, who by now had become startlingly good at identifying what frightened fighters did with their feet. Harry taught not as a professor would, but as Tommy and Arthur in Real Danger had taught him. Control breathing. Do not overextend. Don't waste spell choice on elegance. Know the next move before the first lands. Never assume one disarm ends a conflict if the room still contains other threats. Students left the sessions tired, bruised, sharper. They also left loyal. Not because Harry demanded devotion, because competence under pressure creates its own gravity. That was when the ministry made its second mistake. They treated Harry as a symbol to be publicly discredited, not as a network builder already functioning beneath their notice. By Christmas, the DA was not merely learning spells. It was developing internal discipline, trust routes, response signals, and distributed leadership. Hermione set up encoded communication structure through ordinary homework patterns. Ron managed morale in the uniquely effective way of someone who made danger feel survivable just by complaining about it loudly. Ginny adapted faster than most older students. Neville improved so quickly he seemed to frighten himself with it. And Harry watched the whole thing with the quiet awareness that he had, more or less, built the private trained fighting force Tommy would have built in 1922 if someone had handed him a castle. Umbridge, meanwhile, began her own campaign: inspections, educational decrees, control through humiliation, detentions designed to mark the body through the hand. When Harry emerged from one such detention with blood written into his skin and fury held in perfect stillness, Ron looked ready to commit murder on principle. Hermione went white. Neville's face hardened in a way Harry had seen only rarely before. "She did that to you," Ron said. Harry flexed his hand once. "Yes, we tell McGonagall, we do," Hermione said at once. Harry shook his head, not first. They stared at him. "She wants outrage," Harry said. "She wants emotional opposition. That gives her justification and timeline control. We remove her another way." Hermione's eyes narrowed as the logic landed. "Evidence. More than evidence," Harry said. "File pressure." And so the Umbridge dossier began. It took 6 months. That was the thing about Harry which frustrated enemies and unsettled allies alike. He could hate quickly, but he retaliated on a schedule. He documented detentions, names, methods, decree timings, inspection irregularities, correspondence patterns, petty cruelties that revealed larger vulnerabilities. Through student networks, he learned which ministry officials received private reports from her and which resented being cut out. Through Sirius, he gathered whispers from old political families. Through Gringotts, via channels so discreet even Hermione only knew a third of them, he began tracing financial anxieties around certain Wisengamot members vulnerable to scandal. Hermione built the archive. Ron found gaps in staff corridor movements that let messages travel unseen. Fred and George contributed chaos where useful, which was more often than anyone admitted. And Harry selected the 4 targets, not Umbridge herself at first. That would have been too direct. No, he targeted the men above her and the peers around them, with exactly enough material to make keeping her suddenly more expensive than removing her. The packet delivered anonymously to 4 Wisengamot members in a single morning did not contain forged lies. Tommy had always despised weak blackmail. No, it contained perfectly true details arranged for maximum pressure. Unlawful disciplinary methods, abuse of delegated authority, suppressed correspondence, and one especially ugly thread suggesting misuse of ministry resources for private retaliation against minors. At the bottom of each file was only a single mark in black ink: a peregrine falcon. By afternoon, pressure had begun. By evening, whispers were moving through the right offices. Within the week, Umbridge's certainty had cracked at the edges. She still strutted, still decreed, still punished. But now she watched doors when they opened. Harry noticed and said nothing. When she finally fell, it did not happen because students shouted her down. It happened because the institution she served decided she had become untidy. That, Harry thought, was a lesson worth learning young. Parallel to all this, he cultivated the pure-blood network. Not all pure-blood families were Death Eaters. Not all neutrals were harmless, and not all old grievances pointed in the same direction. Harry knew better than to sort people by ideology alone. Tommy had taught him long ago that every declared principle sat on top of smaller motives if one dug with sufficient patience. Three families in particular drew Harry's interest. None openly aligned with Voldemort. None trusted the Ministry. All had historical reasons to resent both. Through school channels, Sirius's introductions, and Gringotts' whispers, Harry built contact not as friendship but as arrangement. Subtle conversations, carefully worded letters, mutual deniability, small exchanges of useful information that proved competence before asking for anything larger. He never framed it as rebellion. That would have frightened them. He framed it as stability, which, to wealthy neutral families, meant the possibility of surviving whichever side thought it had won. One winter evening, sitting in the room before the fire with Hermione and a spread of family trees, Harry tapped a name with the end of his quill. "They don't want a revolution," he said. Hermione frowned. "Then why talk to us at all?" "Because the current structure is failing and ideologues are bad for asset preservation." Ron, stretched in an armchair, groaned. "You make everyone sound like they're made of ledgers." Harry looked at him. "Most people with inherited power are." Hermione hid a smile. "What are you offering them?" she asked. Harry considered the board, a third option. The answer unsettled even him a little because he heard Tommy in it clearly, not darkness, not Ministry incompetence, an arrangement. By spring, the Shelby name, introduced softly through Sirius, reinforced through Harry's own behavior, and whispered about by families who liked competence more than sentiment, had begun carrying a strange weight in certain circles of wizarding Britain. Not public weight, not yet, but the kind of private recognition that mattered more. A family that defaulted on a promise found Gringotts suddenly less patient. A young heir who had mocked Neville too publicly found his father receiving an embarrassing letter from an ally, asking whether this was really the kind of conduct they meant to display right now. A Slytherin older student who had thought Harry merely a Gryffindor oddity discovered, to his discomfort, that 3 separate channels quietly advised against antagonizing him without excellent reason. Harry did not need to boast. Systems boasted for you if designed correctly. And yet for all his success, 5th year cost him. That part mattered, because this was the stage of Harry's life where others began mistaking effectiveness for invulnerability. They were wrong. His temper worsened after the graveyard. His sleep worsened. The connection to Voldemort felt at times like a wire laid through his skull. Anger came faster. Patience, which Tommy had built into him like a second spine, held, but now it held under strain. Only the inner circle really saw it. Hermione when his voice went flat instead of sharp. Ron when Harry sat silent too long after training and stared into the fire, as if calculating something no boy their age should have to calculate. Neville when he noticed Harry never sat with his back to open doors anymore, unless forced. Sirius saw it too, and understood it with the particular pain of adults watching inherited damage develop in new forms. One night after a DA session, long after the others had gone, Hermione said quietly, "You don't always have to be the one holding the whole structure." Harry was reorganizing training notes. He did not stop. "Yes," he said, "I do." Ron from the doorway answered before Hermione could. "No, you don't." Harry looked up. Ron met his eyes with the rare steadiness he only found when it mattered most. "You think we stay because you built this? That's part of it, but we also stay because at some point it stopped being just yours." Harry said nothing. Hermione stepped closer to the table. "You recruited us," she said. "Fair enough, but that isn't the same thing anymore." Neville, quieter than both, added the last piece. "We know." Harry frowned. "Know what?" "That sometimes," Neville said carefully, "you talk like none of this hurts." Silence. Harry looked from one face to the next and found no accusation there, no fear, no awe either, just knowledge. The stubborn, unwelcome kind that comes from people who have watched too long and too closely to be managed completely. It unsettled him more than almost any threat 5th year had produced, because Tommy had taught him to build loyalty, yes, but not what to do when loyalty stopped being structure and became something more dangerous, something genuine. Harry looked away first. That, more than any confession, told them enough. By the end of 5th year, Harry had achieved something even Dumbledore had not fully managed. He had become central without taking office. The ministry still slandered him in public where it suited them. The prophets still twisted. Teachers still disagreed on what he was becoming. Students still projected myth, fear, admiration, or resentment depending on need. But beneath all that, where real movement happened, Harry had built position. A trained student force loyal more to competence than to titles. A core inner circle bound not by manipulation anymore, but by shared knowledge and chosen endurance. A growing line into Gringotts the ministry could not see. Open respect from Cedric's memory, silent respect from Crumb, wary respect from older students who had learned the hard way not to underestimate him, indirect channels into pure-blood neutrals. A godfather functioning as off-board operative, and, increasingly, a reputation for making problems expensive for the people who caused them. That was the true hostile takeover, not seizing the ministry outright, making its weakness financially, politically, and socially unsustainable until the structure around it began adjusting in anticipation of his future weight. The year closed not with triumph, but with a change in scale. Voldemort was no longer rumor. The ministry's denial no longer held cleanly. The school no longer functioned as an ordinary school. And Harry no longer moved through any of it as a talented student forced into events. He moved like a stakeholder. One evening, back in Small Heath for the brief peace of summer, Harry sat with Tommy in the study while rain moved against the window in thin grey sheets. The old ledgers remained on the shelves. Birmingham still smelled of smoke and wet brick and men who preferred cash to promises. It grounded him in a way Hogwarts never did. Tommy poured whiskey for himself, tea for Harry. "How bad?" Tommy asked. Harry looked at the files spread across the desk. Horcrux notes beginning, ministry names, family pressure points, training structures. Voldemort's return rippling outward through every layer of the board. "Bad enough," Harry said. Tommy lit a cigarette. "And the ministry?" Harry's expression went still in that familiar Shelby way. "Manageable," he said. Tommy gave the smallest nod. No praise, no comfort, just recognition. Then he said, "Good. Governments are easiest to move when they're lying to themselves." Harry took a sip of tea. Outside, Birmingham rain washed the street black and honest. Inside, the war moved to its next phase. And Harry Potter, raised by the Peaky blinders, sharpened by Hogwarts, and now operating with enough influence to trouble governments, began preparing not merely to survive the coming years, but to inherit the shape of them. Chapter 5. The Cost of the Code Year 6, What the Business Asks of You. Tommy once told him, "Every man has something he won't trade. Find it. That's where he's weak." Harry had never found his own. The summer before 6th year began with Dumbledore arriving in Small Heath as though he had every right to step through Birmingham rain and into a house built on distrust. He came just after dusk. The street outside Watery Lane was slick black from an afternoon storm, and the lamps threw a tired yellow over brick and gutter water. Inside, the Shelby house was all the old familiar things. Tobacco, ledger paper, polished wood, footsteps above, a kettle not yet boiled, Arthur arguing with John in the next room over something too petty to matter and too loud to ignore. Then the knock came, not tentative, not official either. A measured knock, a man who understood doors and the stories they told. Tommy opened it himself. Albus Dumbledore stood on the threshold in deep purple robes that somehow did not look ridiculous, though by all sensible laws they should have. His beard was rain-touched. His spectacles caught the whole light. He looked, Harry thought when he saw him a moment later, like the kind of man who had spent most of his life being underestimated by people who mistook eccentricity for softness. Tommy Shelby did not make that mistake. For one brief second neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other, and Harry could almost feel the room adjusting to accommodate the collision of two very different forms of authority. Then Dumbledore said pleasantly, "Mr. Shelby." Tommy's cigarette glowed once in the dark. "Professor?" Polly appeared from the dining room, took one look at the headmaster, and became immediately alert in the way she only did when power entered the house disguised as civility. Harry came down the stairs without hurrying. Dumbledore's gaze moved to him and warmed by a fraction. Harry. Harry stopped 2 steps from the bottom. Headmaster! Arthur, hearing voices, leaned from the kitchen doorway and nearly laughed aloud at the sight of Dumbledore standing in the Shelby Hall as though impossible things had been invited to tea before. John, right behind him, folded his arms and watched with open curiosity. Tommy moved aside at last. "You've come a long way to skip a letter." Dumbledore stepped in. "I find certain conversations improve when held in person." Tommy shut the door. "They also become harder to deny later." Dumbledore smiled faintly. "Quite so." Harry noticed that he did not answer the point. Tea was made because Polly believed in preserving forms even when the situation had already wandered far outside them. They sat in the dining room. Polly at one end of the table like a queen who had never asked Parliament's permission, Tommy near the window, Harry opposite Dumbledore, Arthur and John hovering at the edges until Polly's look pushed them into actual chairs. Dumbledore accepted his cup, glanced once around the room, and said, "You have raised him well." Tommy did not smile. "We raised him usefully." Dumbledore's eyes flicked to Harry, then back. "Those are not always different things." Tommy said, "You didn't come to compliment the furniture." Polly's mouth twitched. Harry looked down at his tea to hide the same impulse. Dumbledore set down the cup. "No," he said. "I came because the war has advanced to a stage where Harry requires information I have withheld too long." The room went still. That, Harry noticed, was interesting. Not may require, not might, not could benefit from requires. Tommy caught it too. "That sounds expensive." "It is," Dumbledore said softly. Harry rested one hand on the table. "What information?" Dumbledore looked at him directly. "About Voldemort," he said. "About why he survived what should have destroyed him, and about what must be done before he can be killed properly." Tommy's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth. Arthur muttered, "Right, there it is then." Polly's eyes sharpened. She had heard the name before in reports, in hints, in the coded letters Harry sent from school and in the silences between them. Hearing it spoken in this house gave it another kind of reality. Harry's voice stayed level. "Tell me." Dumbledore did, not all at once, not in dramatic speeches. He laid it out as he always laid things out when he was at his most dangerous, gently enough that the horror of the thing had room to reach the listener on its own. Tom Riddle's fear of death, his obsession with dividing the soul, murders as anchors, objects made into containers, horcruxes, plural. Harry did not interrupt until Dumbledore paused. "How many?" Harry asked. Dumbledore's face did not change much, but Harry saw the answer there before the man gave it. 6 were intended," Dumbledore said. "1 accidental, 7 pieces of soul in total, though the original body has been restored. We know of several, not all." Tommy leaned back in his chair very slowly. Arthur looked blank. John looked like he was trying to work out whether there was any useful difference between dark magic and lunacy if both produced the same body count. Polly said, "And you've known this how long?" Dumbledore turned to her. "Some time." Tommy spoke before Polly could go further. "And you're telling him now because, Dumbledore said, the stage at which I might spare him involvement has passed." Harry let that sit in the room a moment. Then he asked the question Tommy would have approved of first. "What do you have confirmed?" Dumbledore watched him, not sadly, not proudly, something more complex and in its way less comforting than either. "A diary," he said. "Destroyed, a ring, destroyed. A locket, though the one I recovered was false. A cup may be one, possibly an object tied to Ravenclaw. Nagini is a strong possibility, and," he hesitated, "there remains the question of what happened in Godric's Hollow the night your parents died." Harry's eyes did not leave his face. "Say it plainly." Dumbledore inclined his head. "A fragment of Voldemort's soul attached itself to the only living thing in the room when his curse rebounded." Silence. Arthur stopped breathing for about 3 seconds. John looked at Harry. Polly looked at Dumbledore as if assessing where, exactly, one would place a knife to make an old man feel the inadequacy of his timing. Tommy said nothing at all, which was much worse. Harry sat completely still, not because the revelation had not hit him, because it had. and because he had been raised to understand that some information entered a room not to be felt first, but to be processed before feeling ruined its shape. "A Horcrux," he said, "in me." "A fragment," Dumbledore corrected carefully. "Not one made intentionally, but yes." Harry nodded once, then again more slowly. "What destroys them?" Dumbledore's eyes sharpened. "Harry, what destroys them?" There was no anger in the question, which made it more serious. "Basilisk venom," Dumbledore said. "Fiendfire, though it is dangerously uncontrolled. Goblin-forged enchantment may help in certain cases, but not reliably without correct design. The soul fragment must be damaged beyond magical repair." Harry reached for a notebook from the sideboard where he had left it after dinner, opened it to a blank page, and began writing. Arthur stared. "That's what you're doing." Harry did not look up. "Yes," Dumbledore watched the pencil move. "You need not turn this into a ledger." Harry finally lifted his eyes. "If I don't, it remains a sermon." Tommy's mouth twitched around smoke. Polly folded her hands. "Good answer." Dumbledore, to his credit, did not bristle. If anything, he looked more tired than before. Harry wrote headings with ruthless neatness: confirmed, probable, methods, custodians, security, timeline. Then he looked up again. "How long have you been operating as a one-man intelligence service?" Dumbledore's brows rose a fraction. "Some years." "That was a mistake." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. John stared at Harry like he'd just watched someone slap a bishop. Dumbledore did not react immediately. Then, very softly, "You may be right." Harry leaned back. "You have partial knowledge distributed through no secure chain. Succession planning that appears to depend on your continued survival, no visible redundancy structure, and, if the Locket situation is any indication, active penetration you did not detect early enough." The silence after that was so complete the ticking clock in the hall seemed suddenly offensive. Tommy took a drag of his cigarette and looked out the rain-streaked window with the expression of a man hearing someone else speak a language he recognized perfectly. Dumbledore regarded Harry over steepled fingers. "Your mother," he said after a moment, "was kind." Harry held his gaze. "I know," Harry said. "I've read about her." The words landed harder than any accusation, because everyone at that table heard what lived underneath them, not contempt, not self-pity. The fact that Harry knew his mother most fully through records, stories, and second-hand virtues rather than memory or love. That kindness had become part of his inheritance as a documented trait rather than an experienced one. Dumbledore absorbed that in silence. Tommy, across the table, looked at Harry with a brief, unreadable intensity before letting his face go still again. The business of the night continued, because in the Shelby house, one could be wounded and operational at the same time. By the end of the conversation, Harry had what he wanted: a working picture, however incomplete, and the admission that Dumbledore would begin bringing him into the hunt directly. What he did not have, though he understood it better than anyone else in the room, was time in a clean shape. And that, Tommy had taught him long ago, was the one resource clever men most often lied to themselves about. Sixth year began with war no longer hidden behind children's stories. The Daily Prophet hedged, the ministry postured, families tightened around themselves. Diagon Alley moved like a city hearing distant artillery and deciding whether pretending otherwise might help. At Hogwarts, the old routines remained, but they had changed color. Students whispered more. Owls arrived heavier with parental instructions. Slytherins watched other tables with new calculation. Teachers spoke in cleaner sentences because mess invited fear. Harry moved through it, as he always did, observing, indexing, redistributing attention away from himself where possible and toward useful channels where not. But the year's true shape was set by Dumbledore's lessons, not classroom lessons. Private ones. The pensive, old memories, Tom Riddle's past laid out like a pathology report of a nation too vain to notice what it was breeding. Harry watched orphanage rooms, charming murders, family histories, vanity disguised as brilliance, and each time the same pattern emerged more clearly. Voldemort was not merely evil, he was consistent, that mattered. Tommy had always said men became manageable once you understood what they valued above all competing claims. Fear, pride, money, reputation, blood, legacy, revenge. There was always a top line. The rest was noise. Voldemort's top line was immortality through significance. He did not simply want to live. He wanted the world arranged around the fact of his living, which meant every Horcrux would be both practical and symbolic. Harry took notes after each lesson. He built not an academic theory, but a destruction schedule. The room of requirement became less a student operations center now and more a planning chamber. Hermione took one look at Harry's first draft and called it ghastly, then reorganized it into something actually legible. Ron supplied the obvious questions that saved them from clever stupidity. Neville contributed location logic, where hidden architecture or neglected spaces were involved. Ginny, increasingly intolerant of anyone forgetting she existed simply because she was not in the original trio, pointed out vulnerabilities in human behavior that none of the boys had clocked. Harry accepted all of it. That was one of the changes sixth year revealed most clearly. The manipulation had not disappeared from him, that was too deep in the bone. But more and more inside the circle, he had stopped controlling for dominance and started controlling for clarity. He wrote the Horcrux board in 4 columns: object, custodian, security type, destruction method, diary, destroyed, ring, destroyed, locket, false recovered, true location unknown, cup likely Lestrange line, high security vault probable, Ravenclaw object unknown, probable old house concealment or founder site significance. Nagini mobile live protection asset requires strike conditions. Harry himself, unresolved, unacceptable, no action pending until more certainty. Ron stood staring at the last line one evening and said very carefully, "I don't like how calm you are writing that." Harry capped the ink. "Calm helps." "No," Ron said. "It helps you, that's not the same." Hermione looked between them. "Ron, no," Ron said again, not loudly but with force. "We're acting like if we organize this well enough it stops being what it is." Harry's face stayed unreadable. "What is it?" Ron stepped closer to the table. "You." There it was. The room went still. Harry could have turned away, could have deflected, could have said the mission mattered more than the vessel, and perhaps part of him even believed that on the most tactical level. But by sixth year, Ron knew him too well for those tricks to work cleanly. Harry looked at the board, then at Ron, then at Hermione, who was already pale because she had followed the same logic days ago and hated that she had. Then at Neville, who had gone quiet in the way he did when something mattered enough that careless words became offensive. Finally, Harry said, "I know what line that is." Ron's jaw tightened. Good! It was not a reconciliation, exactly. But it was the moment the subject stopped belonging to Harry alone. That mattered. It frightened him slightly, and because it frightened him, he respected it. Slughorn entered the year the way certain useful men always did. Warmly, indulgently, and with both hands already full of invisible balances. Harry knew the type at once, not malicious, not heroic either, a collector of people and favors. A man who liked proximity to future importance because it let him feel important in the present. Tommy would have called him a middleman with taste. Dumbledore wanted a memory from him, a crucial one. So Harry approached Slughorn not as a student seeking approval, but as an investor cultivating a soft asset. He attended the dinners, allowed himself to be displayed selectively, let Slughorn believe he was charming Harry toward patronage, while in reality, Harry was building a pattern map of the man's vanities, regrets, and escape habits. Hermione disapproved of the parties on principle. Ron disliked them because the food was excellent and the company often wasn't. Ginny found the whole thing hilarious. "You're being courted," she said one evening in the common room while Harry loosened his tie with visible relief. "No," Harry replied. "I'm being catalogued," she smirked. "That sounds worse. It's more accurate." Eventually, the memory came, as Dumbledore knew it would, not through pressure but through precision. Harry chose the evening after a small gathering where Slughorn had drunk enough to become nostalgic and not enough to become defensive. He let the conversation drift to legacy, brilliance, gifted students destroyed by their own excesses, the burden of seeing talent go wrong. Then he stopped performing and spoke plainly. "Professor," Harry said, "if a man becomes what he becomes because the adults who saw it early preferred admiration to intervention, that doesn't stay only his crime." Slughorn went still. Harry held his gaze. "I don't need comfort," he said. "I need the truth." For a long moment, Slughorn looked like an old man caught between vanity and conscience, and it was conscience that won by a small, trembling margin. When the real memory finally spilled silver into the pensive, and Tom Riddle's younger voice asked about Horcruxes with that terrible cultivated curiosity, Dumbledore later called Harry's handling of the matter remarkably mature. Harry thought it had been simple. "Every man has something he won't trade," Tommy had said. Slughorn wouldn't trade the last illusion that he had only ever been a benign spectator. So Harry took the memory by making him choose whether he wanted to remain one. By winter, the Draco problem had become impossible to ignore. Other people saw a school rival grown meaner and more secretive. Harry saw a boy under assignment. Draco's movements had changed. Too much isolation, too much brittle certainty overlaid on actual fear. Wrong associates at wrong hours. Repeated access attempts around rooms and cabinets no one else cared about. Sudden silences when adults passed. Harry knew that shape. It was the shape of someone trying to carry an impossible instruction because the cost of failure had been made personal. He did not pity Draco, but he understood him. That made the situation more dangerous, not less. Dumbledore knew too. Snape certainly did. The difference was that Dumbledore approached the matter like a man balancing souls, while Harry approached it like a security breach with emotional components. He built a second board. Draco, objective unknown, timeline pressured, family leverage extreme, likely access point inside school, probable task assigned by Voldemort to test loyalty or guarantee punishment. Hermione read the board and said, "You've turned him into a case file." "He turned himself into one," Harry replied. "What do you think he's meant to do?" Ron asked. Harry looked at the line twice before answering. "Something public enough to count," he said. "Something difficult enough that failure hurts. Something that proves he can carry murder if ordered." Ron stared. Neville went rigid. Ginny said the word none of them wanted first. "Dumbledore." Harry nodded once. The room seemed colder after that. What made the whole thing unbearable was not that Harry failed to notice the threat. He noticed it early. He tracked it. He understood the shape of it better than most adults involved. What he did not control was the timeline. That was the year's real cruelty. He could prepare for named targets, known routes, structured operations. But Voldemort, through Draco, had introduced a moving deadline with emotional coercion at its center. The board was being forced from the other side. Tommy had warned him about that too. The best planners in the world still bled when opponents chose the hour. Harry wrote to Small Heath in a harsher hand than usual. Enemy forcing board through child asset. Timeline obscured. Need principle, not detail. Tommy's answer came in 2 lines. When the enemy uses family as leverage, the operation is already emotional. That makes it sloppier and crueler. Watch for the point where mercy and exploitation become the same route. Harry read that note 3 times, then he burned it. Because he understood, even before the year reached its end, that Draco was both weapon and hostage. And that made every choice around him worse. The locket led Harry and Dumbledore to the cave. By then, the schedule had advanced beyond school operations and into direct fieldwork. Dumbledore did not bring the others. He did not explain fully why. Harry suspected part of it was trust, part practicality, part the old man's still annoying habit of carrying some burdens like private penance. The journey to the sea felt like the edge of something older than war. Black water. Rock. Wind that seemed to scrape thought down to its hard parts. In the cave, Harry saw at once what Dumbledore meant when he spoke of magic built not just to defend, but to humiliate anyone attempting the breach. Blood price at the entrance, inferi waiting below like a reserve army of the dead. The basin, the potion. and in the center of it all, one truth. Voldemort had hidden part of his soul in a place designed to require another person's suffering in order to reach it. Harry hated him more clearly then than perhaps ever before, not for murder alone, for the architecture of contempt. When Dumbledore drank the potion, Harry obeyed because obedience was the only useful shape left. He forced the liquid down an old man's throat, while Dumbledore shook with visions Harry could not see, begged for mercy to people long dead, and briefly became not the headmaster of Hogwarts but a tired, mortal man whose greatness had not protected him from memory. Harry did not falter. That mattered later, because people sometimes think the hardest thing is refusing action. Often the hardest thing is carrying it through when the necessary action is itself a form of cruelty. They retrieved the locket. It was false. A note from Araby, another penetration. Another missing asset. Another timeline Harry had not even known existed until it had already stolen ground. On the return journey, Dumbledore was weakened enough to lean on him openly, and Harry felt, for the first time in years, something dangerously close to pure fear. Not battlefield fear. Not the clean alertness of threat, the fear of losing the one man who held the widest map of the war in his head. That fear irritated him because it was strategically unsound. It also made it no less real. At Hogwarts, dark over the towers and the mark burning green above the astronomy tower, Harry knew at once the hour had finally been chosen. Too soon. Too fast. Wrong vector. Draco had moved. The castle had been penetrated. Death Eaters inside. The board forced. Dumbledore immobilized Harry under the cloak before the confrontation on the tower unfolded. Later Harry would understand exactly why. At the time, pinned and hidden, he could only watch, Draco pale and shaking, wand up, voice fraying. Dumbledore talking him down not like a duelist, but like an old priest trying to shepherd one more soul away from a cliff edge, the Death Eaters arriving. Noise. Chaos. Then Snape. And in that suspended moment, Harry did the fastest calculation of his life. Could he break the bind? Possibly, not in time. Could he intervene openly? Perhaps, long enough to get both himself and Dumbledore killed with no guarantee of stopping the larger breach. Could Dumbledore survive if the operation already depended on Snape's cover and Draco's failure being managed exactly this way? Unlikely. Would acting on instinct destroy the intelligence position Dumbledore had been maintaining around Snape for years and collapse every advantage still hidden on their side? Very likely. 2 seconds. That was all. 2 seconds in which Harry understood that the correct tactical decision and the intolerable personal one had become the same. Then Snape said the curse, and Dumbledore fell. The sound of his body hitting the dark was something Harry would remember long after he forgot dozens of clearer noises from battles, because there was no drama to it, only finality. When the bind broke, Harry moved like violence given human form, through corridors, through smoke, through pursuing Death Eaters, across grounds split by battle and panic. He chased Snape because some part of him still wanted the mathematics undone by force. Snape blocked everything. Not flamboyantly, efficiently, with the sick familiarity of a man who knew Harry's style better than Harry had realized. "Have you learned nothing?" Snape snapped during one exchange, deflecting a curse that would have shattered stone. "Do not use your anger as if it were originality." Harry's hatred in that moment was bright enough to choke on, but even then, some colder part of him noticed the line. Not mocking, instructive almost, it made no sense. Which was precisely why it lodged. Snape fled, the castle burned in pockets of aftermath. And Harry, standing in the wreckage of a year he had partly understood and wholly failed to control, realized the true cost of the code he had been raised by. Sometimes you make the right call, and the right call still destroys something in you. The aftermath belonged in many ways not to Harry but to Ron, Hermione, and Neville, because they were the ones who saw him after. Not the public Harry, not the leader, not the terrifyingly composed boy who could already give teachers reports clearer than their own. The actual one. the one who came back from the tower with his face emptied out into something colder than grief. In the room of requirement the next day, the Horcrux board still stood on the wall. The schedules still hung. Notes still pinned under Hermione's careful hand. The structure remained. Dumbledore did not. Harry stood before the board in silence. Ron entered first, stopped, and said very quietly, "You knew something was going to happen." It was not accusation, which made it impossible to dodge. Harry kept looking at the board. Yes. Hermione went pale immediately. Neville shut the door behind them. Ron took another step. How much? Not the hour, Harry said. Not the exact route, enough to know Draco had a task, enough to know Snape was inside some arrangement with Dumbledore, enough to know intervention at the wrong point could destroy more than it saved. Ron stared at him. And you just stood there. Harry turned then. The answer would have been easy if he had not cared. Could have been delivered with pure logic, clean and cruel and complete. Dumbledore was dying already. Snape's position mattered. The network mattered. The war was bigger than one man, all true. Harry could not make himself say any of it first. Instead he said, "I made the correct tactical decision." The room flinched, because that was worse than if he'd claimed helplessness, worse than if he'd lied. Ron looked at him as if seeing the edge of something he had always known lived there and had hoped never to meet this directly. "And how does that feel?" Ron asked. Harry almost answered irrelevant. The word reached his tongue and stopped. Because Neville was watching him with that terrible steady gaze of his, and Hermione already had tears in her eyes out of sheer fury at the premise. And Ron who had stayed through jealousy, fear, war, humiliation, doubt, was not asking as a strategist. He was asking as someone who refused to let Harry turn himself entirely into the machine Tommy had built. Harry looked away first. "That," he said, voice lower now, "appears to be the problem." No one spoke. Hermione crossed the room before he could stop her and set both hands flat on the edge of the table, grounding herself. "You don't get to do this alone anymore," she said. "I know." "No," she said, sharper. "You say that, but every time it matters you go back into your own head and lock the door." Ron nodded once. "And then you come out with a plan and expect us to just stand where you put us." Neville's voice was the quietest and therefore the hardest to ignore. "We would have stayed anyway." Harry looked at him. Neville held his gaze. "That's the part you still don't understand." For a moment, the room contained only breathing, fire crackle, and the old castle around them carrying on, as if institutions had ever truly known how to mourn useful men. Harry sat down, not because he was weak, because standing had begun to feel like performance. Hermione came around the table and took the chair opposite. Ron dropped into the one beside him with a kind of angry loyalty that only Ron could manage. Neville remained standing by the board, hands at his sides, as if holding watch over all of them. And there, in that hidden room with the war sharpened, Dumbledore dead, and the mission finally stripped of every last excuse for pretending it belonged to adults, the four of them became something stronger than recruitment. Not followers, not assets. Not even, in the thin, easy way children used the word, friends. They became the people who knew the cost and stayed anyway. Harry understood then, perhaps fully for the first time, where his real vulnerability lay, not time pressure alone. Not grief alone, those were conditions. The wound itself was this. He had people now who could break him simply by being endangered, and he had not noticed when that stopped being an exploitable weakness and became a truth he would rather die than surrender. Tommy had told him to find the thing a man wouldn't trade. Harry finally had. And it frightened him more than Voldemort ever had. He stood again after a long while and looked at the board. Then, in a voice back under control but changed somehow by having broken once inside the room, he said, "All right." Hermione wiped at her eyes angrily. "All right what?" Harry picked up the chalk. "Here's the problem," he said. "Here's what we know. Here's what I've worked out. Here's what I need from each of you." Ron let out a breath that was almost a laugh despite everything. Hermione closed her eyes once in exhausted affection. Neville nodded as if this, finally, was a language all of them shared. The business would continue. Not because Harry felt nothing, because he didn't. and because now there were witnesses enough to prevent him lying to himself about that ever again. By the end of 6th year, Harry Potter stood nearly at the ceiling of what a wizard his age could be measured by. His raw power was immense, his control refined, his tactical mind frighteningly mature, his network wide, his alliances real, his enemies alert. He had integrated goblin intelligence, student militia training, family leverage, field operations, and symbolic warfare into something no one in the school generation beneath or around him could truly match. And yet the year had taught him his limit. He was strongest when he could prepare. Voldemort knew that now. The final war would not arrive politely on schedules Harry designed. It would come broken, forced, grieving, and fast. The enemy would try to choose the hour, which meant Harry's last education, the one Tommy Shelby had warned him toward without ever fully naming, still lay ahead. Sometimes the enemy forces the board, and you have to win anyway. Chapter 6, the final accounting the Battle of Hogwarts. By any means Voldemort wanted a legend. Harry gave him a trap. Harry did not leave Hogwarts after Dumbledore's funeral the way other boys left schools. He left it like a man stepping out of one phase of war and into another. There were no proper goodbyes. Not really, not in the soft, ordinary sense. There were logistics, false trails, letters sent through channels too quiet for the ministry to notice, quiet meetings in the room of requirement, coded arrangements with Sirius, and a final walk through the castle's older corridors with the kind of attention men usually gave battlefields they intended to return to under worse conditions. Because Harry knew he would return. The only uncertainty was whether he would come back as a student, fugitive, or architect of the end. The summer after 6th year was the most disciplined of his life. Not because he felt disciplined, because he did not trust himself to leave anything important to mood. Dumbledore's death had split something in him cleanly enough that even he could no longer pretend the war belonged to institutions. Whatever illusions still remained in wizarding Britain, that ministries could contain this, that schools could outweight it, that old titles would somehow rise to meet the hour, Harry had none of them left. Voldemort had returned. Dumbledore had fallen. The adults were now, at best, fragmented allies operating under damage. So Harry did what the Shelbys had always done best when governments failed. He built parallel structure. The headquarters shifted that summer from Hogwarts to a set of moving rooms across Britain. Grimmauld Place when it could be used, a safe house Sirius maintained under 3 names and no formal ownership. A disused cottage outside York obtained through a neutral family who preferred not to know details. And, occasionally, a back office in Small Heath, where Tommy Shelby sat under lamplight and treated Horcrux destruction like an ugly merger that had to be completed before competitors realized how exposed they were. That first full planning session in Birmingham lasted 6 hours. Tommy at the head of the table, Polly to his right, Harry opposite them, notebook open, Hermione with files, Ron with maps and a look that said he still couldn't believe this was his life. Neville silent at first, then increasingly vital as the conversation moved from theory to routes, grounds, hidden spaces, and what old magical places did when they were left alone too long. Sirius leaned against the mantel halfway through and muttered, "This is the strangest criminal conspiracy I've ever attended." Tommy did not look up from the parchment in front of him. "No," he said, "the strangest criminal conspiracies wear uniforms." Polly's mouth twitched. Ron choked on his tea. Hermione, against all intentions, smiled. Then the work resumed. Harry had rebuilt the Horcrux board from memory and improved it. The childish uncertainty of 6th year had hardened into operational structure. Diary destroyed, ring destroyed, locket real location now narrowed. Cup, almost certainly Gringotts. Ravenclaw object, increasingly likely tied to Hogwarts itself. Nagini, close protection asset, likely never separated from Voldemort without stage conditions. Harry, unresolved, acknowledged, unbearable. The board remained on that last line for several seconds longer than the others. Tommy noticed. He tapped ash into a tray. We leave that until it becomes impossible not to. Hermione looked at him sharply, perhaps expecting some harder answer. Harry did too. Tommy met neither of their eyes and went on. If you treat every problem as the first one you must solve, you lose to sequencing. Harry let out a quiet breath. That, more than comfort would have, steadied him, because Tommy was not telling him the truth was smaller than it was. He was telling him not to die early just because the final bill already existed. And so the hunt began properly. The first months of the mission had none of the glory stories later generations liked to attach to them. No constant heroics, no elegant camping montages, no romance of noble suffering. It was harder and uglier than that. Travel in bad weather, wrong leads, half-trusted contacts, ministry watchers, snatchers on roads, neutral families losing their nerve, sleep cut into shifts, meals reduced to function, arguments over routes, risk, timing, whether Harry was pushing too hard, whether Ron was right to object, whether Hermione's caution had become its own trap, whether Neville should be kept away from the more dangerous operations, and whether he had not already earned the right to ignore that suggestion. He had. The locket came first because the false one Dumbledore had recovered had at least given them a trail, Regulus Black. R.A.B. Sirius had spent years hating his brother with the clean heat that comes from pain made simple on purpose. Now he had to revisit him as something else. Not good, not innocent, but a man who had reached one correct conclusion late and acted on it without applause. The truth lay with Kreacher. Harry got it by changing method. Earlier in life he might have coerced, threatened, cornered, but by this stage he understood something Tommy had also always known. Some servants guarded truth not because they were loyal to institutions, but because no one had ever asked them as if they mattered. So Harry sat before Kreacher in Grimmauld Place and said simply, "Tell me what Regulus asked of you." The elf stared, then it spoke. The cave, the potion, the locket stolen, Regulus's death, Kreacher's failure to destroy the thing afterward. When the story ended, Sirius had gone very still. Hermione looked furious on behalf of everyone involved. Ron muttered something that sounded like, "Of course the entire war turns out to be full of old rich families being mad in their own houses." Harry only asked, "Where did the locket go next?" That led to Mundungus Fletcher, then to Dolores Umbridge, who had worn the stolen thing against her chest at the ministry like bureaucracy had become jewelry. Removing it from her required no duel in public halls, no triumphant speech. It required infiltration. Harry drew the plan in 6 clean stages. Hermione built credentials. Ron handled movement windows and escape timing. Sirius secured an outer route. Neville, who had become startlingly calm around danger once given a defined role, mapped the building's older maintenance routes from a combination of stolen archives and pure observational stubbornness. The ministry operation succeeded not because any one part of it was brilliant, but because every part had been assigned correctly. Harry got close to Umbridge long enough to confirm the locket. Hermione diverted inquiry with procedural precision sharp enough to make actual officials look clumsy. Ron improvised once, badly but effectively, and would later spend 2 hours insisting that counted as planned initiative. Neville's route saved them 7 minutes and probably their lives. When they escaped, coughing on dust and adrenaline in a half-collapsed service tunnel, Harry tore the locket from its chain and held it for 1 long second in his palm. Another piece, another debt called in. Destroying it proved harder. Its enchantments attacked not only the mind, but the vulnerabilities already present in the people around it. That was its real danger. Voldemort understood that objects didn't need to overpower the strong if they could instead distort the fractures already running through them. Ron nearly broke under it once. Hermione lost patience with Harry twice. Harry himself, who had built a whole life out of compartmentalization, found the thing peculiarly hateful because it reflected every private doubt back with the confidence of prophecy. He destroyed it in the end with the sword of Gryffindor, but only after they had all paid for the delay in ways none of them found easy to name aloud. When the locket cracked, and the soul fragment inside it died screaming, Harry felt no triumph, only reduction. One less thing in the world. One less lie continuing. That became the rhythm of the year, not victory. Clearance. Gringotts came next. The cup had always been the most obvious and the most difficult. Old family. Old vault. Bellatrix Lestrange. Institutional pride layered over security so deep it might as well have been religion. And yet the goblin line Harry had built years ago now returned value exactly as intended. Ragnarok Vale did not meet Harry as a child anymore. He met him as a dangerous client whose requests were inconveniently rational. Their conversation took place in a private chamber with no decoration beyond what wealth becomes when it has stopped caring whether it looks expensive. "You understand," Ragnarok said, hands folded on the desk, "that what you are asking me is not merely information. It is participation." Harry sat opposite him, Hermione to one side, Bill Weasley at the other because knowledge of curses had become suddenly more useful than family embarrassment. "I understand," Harry said. "And why?" Ragnarok asked. "Should Gringotts tie itself to your outcome?" Harry did not answer immediately. Because the true answer mattered. Finally he said, "Because if Voldemort wins, he won't share power with institutions he can't command. He'll gut them, then call it order. If the Ministry wins without being changed, it returns to the same blindness that made this possible. I'm not asking you to choose heroism. I'm asking you to choose the future in which your leverage remains real." Ragnarok watched him for several seconds. Then, almost lazily, "You speak like someone who has been listening to goblins." Tommy, Harry thought, Polly too, and bitter clerks. And clever enemies, and every failed institution in Britain, but he only said, "I listen to anyone who understands power without pretending it's morality." That did it, not full alliance. Goblins did not grant those in words ordinary people could hear, but enough. Enough for whispers about the vault structure. Enough to confirm Bellatrix's paranoia had increased after the Ministry infiltration. Enough to narrow the risk points. Enough to know the break-in would need speed, dragon confusion, curse awareness, and absolute nerve. It became one of the ugliest operations Harry ever approved. Polyjuice, disguise, pressure, luck sharpened by preparation, and the dragon below used as accidental artillery the moment the lower vault structures began collapsing into panic. Hermione held the disguise line until Bellatrix's manner nearly gave her away. Ron did better at impersonation than anyone expected because panic, apparently, improved his acting. Bill's warnings saved them twice. Harry got to the cup with cuts on both hands and heat rising behind him like the bank itself had taken insult personally. When they escaped, clinging to the dragon over London's sky while sirens of magical alarm tore through the city beneath them, Ron shouted something halfway between terror and delight. Hermione yelled back that if they lived, she intended to kill him. Harry laughed once, breathless and disbelieving, because sometimes surviving a thing large enough made ordinary reactions absurd. The cup was destroyed within the hour, Basilisk Fang. No ceremony, two gone under their direct hand now, the pattern was tightening, so was time. The Ravenclaw object brought them back to Hogwarts before the battle had even begun. By then, the school had become something darker than Harry's old memory of it. Not ruined. Worse in some ways. Occupied by fear, warped by surveillance, held together by students too young to deserve the responsibilities forced on them, and teachers forced to choose every day between resistance and survival. Neville met them inside the hidden passage from the Hog's Head. For one suspended second, Harry saw not the quiet first year from the train, but the result of 6 years of pressure correctly endured. Neville had grown into his face, into his voice, into his anger. His robes were scorched at one sleeve, his jaw had hardened. There was a cut near his temple and no embarrassment anywhere in him now. "You took your time," Neville said. Harry looked at him, then at the students gathering behind Ginny, Luna, the remains of the DA, younger faces too sharp now. "We've been busy," Harry replied. Neville's mouth twitched once. Same. The reunion lasted only seconds before the school itself swallowed them back into motion. Finding the diadem became a convergence of everything Harry had built since first year. Lore, memory, hidden architecture, house history, old vanity, overlooked staff knowledge, and the room of requirement itself. Because where else would Hogwarts hide the object of a founder if not among all the things its students thought they had merely lost? The room was different now when Harry opened it for the search, larger, stranger, a city of discarded objects, mountains of lost property. History piled in silence. He understood at once why Voldemort had chosen it, not because it was secret, many things were secret, because it was the perfect symbolic hiding place for a mind like his. A room full of things forgotten by lesser people. A vault built out of the castle's own neglect. The diadem lay there waiting, and when it was destroyed, again by Fang, again without glory, the castle itself seemed to shift. Harry felt it, a kind of pressure change. Like a board clearing toward its final line, then he knew, not in full shape. But enough. Nagini remained, and himself. The last two were not objects, which meant the end game could no longer be handled as recovery and destruction alone. It had become theater. Voldemort would need an audience. That was his weakness. And Harry, who had spent years studying men who required rooms to witness them, understood suddenly exactly what the final operation had to become. A trap large enough to fit a legend. The Battle of Hogwarts did not begin when spells started flying. It began 6 months earlier. That was the truth history flattened because timing bored people, unless it was dramatic. Harry had chosen the battlefield long before Voldemort believed he had. Not by announcing it, by shaping the conditions under which Hogwarts would become the only place the war could end cleanly. He had prepared the DA not as a school rebellion, but as a distributed defensive unit. Sector responsibility, messenger lines, fallback points, medical stations, wand caches, defensive choke points, evacuation routes for younger students. Neville and Ginny had kept the spirit of resistance alive inside the castle long after formal safety disappeared. Seamus Finnegan, once seen as comic relief by idiots, turned out to have exactly the kind of mind one wanted around explosives and collapsing stone. Luna functioned as if chaos were merely an alternative administrative system. McGonagall, when brought fully into the operational picture at last, accepted her role with the calm of a general who had waited years for permission to stop pretending she was only a teacher. Even the Goblin line played its part. 3 Death Eater families found old debts called in almost simultaneously in the 48 hours before the battle. Not enough to ruin them outright. Enough to create panic, freeze asset movement, and force attention sideways. One sent money instead of men. Another sent 1 heir instead of 3. A third entered the battle already split internally over whether their long-term position with Voldemort remained financially survivable. Harry did not need all of them absent. He only needed them calculating. That morning, messages went out to several of Voldemort's remaining allies through channels no one would ever fully trace. Each message was different. Each laid out, with brutal precision, exactly what its recipient stood to lose if they raised a wand in the wrong place that night. Titles, vault access, family claims, names their enemies would remember, proof already distributed, no grand threats, just ledgers, just consequence. Tommy Shelby would have approved more than he ever said. When Voldemort finally marched toward Hogwarts, expecting a dramatic surrender and a final crushing spectacle, a surprising amount of his inner circle was already fighting 2 battles at once. The visible one, and the quieter terror of what Harry Potter had arranged around their future if they survived on the losing side. That mattered. It did not stop the battle, but it thinned certainty. And certainty was what Voldemort fed on most. The first open clash inside Hogwarts was controlled chaos. McGonagall animated statues with a voice like judgment given legal authority. Slughorn, to his own surprise and everyone else's, stayed. Molly Weasley moved like maternal fury with a target list. Kingsley fought with the kind of steady pressure Harry had come to trust in very few adults. The younger students were evacuated where possible, though many had to be physically ordered out because courage in children so often resembled self-destruction wearing good intentions. Neville commanded the left flank. That was not symbolic. It was correct. He had the temperament for it now. Calm under pressure, difficult to rattle, attentive to people rather than abstract glory. Harry passed him the assignment in the entrance hall while explosions rolled somewhere above, and the castle shook dust from the rafters like an old dog coming awake. Neville nodded once. "No speeches?" he asked. Harry looked at him. "You need one?" Neville's mouth twitched. "No, good. Hold the corridor. Don't chase." Neville rested his hand on the hilt of the sword for a moment, then turned and went. Ron and Hermione handled central movement and continuity, which was what they had effectively been doing for years under other names. Hermione's mind under battle conditions became almost terrifying in its clarity. Ron, who had once feared being the least remarkable person in any room containing Harry, now proved himself indispensable precisely because he understood when plans broke in human ways. He saw panic before tacticians did. Saw morale. Saw when a line was about to turn into rout simply because too many exhausted people had stopped believing the next 10 seconds were survivable. Ginny took the upper passages. Luna ran messages through routes no sane enemy could predict, because Luna herself seemed only partially bound by sane expectation. Seamus and Dean handled structural interference. Flitwick defended like compressed brilliance set loose. Sprout turned the school's own grounds vicious with botanical enthusiasm. Harry moved through all of it not as the lone hero at the center, but as command pressure, fixing breaks, reinforcing decisions, appearing where the line needed certainty, vanishing before anyone could turn that into dependence. That was crucial. He could not afford to become the single visible hinge, because the actual hinge lay elsewhere. Nagini had to die, and Harry had to let himself be killed first. He knew it with final certainty 36 hours before he told the others. Those were the worst 36 hours of his life, not the graveyard, not the cave, not Dumbledore's fall. Those had all contained urgency clear enough to overpower thought. This was worse because it contained time. Time to confirm the logic. Time to test alternatives. Time to wonder whether there existed any brilliant, unnoticed loophole he had somehow missed, any structure clever enough to preserve both himself and the clean destruction of the soul fragment within him. There wasn't. He searched anyway. When he finally called Ron, Hermione, and Neville into the room, the battle had not yet begun in open form, but Hogwarts already carried the electrical tension of an approaching storm. The board on the wall had been stripped down to its final lines. Nagini, Harry, nothing else remained. They looked at the board. Then at him. Hermione understood first. Her face lost color all at once. Ron said, "No." Neville did not speak. Harry set both hands on the table and said very evenly, "Here's the problem." Ron shook his head. "No, don't do that. Don't say it like it's one of the others." "It is one of the others," Harry said. "It's just the last one." Hermione's voice came out thin with anger. "There has to be another way." Harry's eyes met hers. "I know." That silenced her because she knew what those words meant coming from him. Not dismissal, not fatalism. He had looked. He had measured. He had hated the answer and failed to change it. Neville finally asked, "When?" "Before the final confrontation," Harry said. "If Voldemort kills me himself, the fragment in me goes with the curse. That matters. After that, Nagini has to die before he understands what's happened." Ron stared at him as if fury might alter the architecture of the universe if only concentrated enough. "You're talking about walking into him." "Yes." "No." Harry's voice remained maddeningly calm. "Ron!" "No." Ron stepped forward so hard the chair behind him nearly fell. "You don't get to organize your own death like it's another bloody corridor assignment." Hermione was crying now, furious at herself for it, and making no effort to hide either thing. Neville looked like someone holding a wall up from the inside. Harry let the anger hit him. He did not turn away. Because this, too, was part of not lying to himself anymore. When Ron finished, when Hermione had nothing left but breathing, when even Neville's silence had become its own accusation, Harry said the thing that mattered most. "I'm telling you because it has to be distributed correctly," he said. "Not because I think you'll like it. After I'm gone, the sequence is this. Protect the body if possible only until Nagini is confirmed exposed. Then kill the snake. Then force public confrontation. He needs an audience. He'll go to speech before execution if he thinks he's won." Hermione wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "You've planned your own death around his vanity." Harry looked at the board. "Around his habits." Neville stepped closer. "And what," he asked quietly, "do you need from me?" Harry looked up at him, and in that moment the answer felt both simple and enormous. "I need you not to break," Harry said. Neville's eyes sharpened. "I won't," he said. Harry believed him. Ron sat down hard in the nearest chair and stared at nothing. Hermione came around the table and put both hands on Harry's face so abruptly it startled him. Not romantic, not delicate, just anger and grief and affection refusing abstraction. "I hate this," she said. "I know, and I'm not agreeing with it. I know." She lowered her hands. "That isn't the same as leaving." Harry closed his eyes once. "No," he said. "It isn't." Then the meeting ended because battles do not wait for private devastation to finish being devout about itself. The walk into the Forbidden Forest was the only truly solitary thing Harry did that night, not because no one would have gone with him. They would have, because this part could not be shared. He moved through broken grounds and smoke and distant cries, under a sky scorched by curses, with the snitch in his hand and the resurrection stone briefly opening the space around him to the dead who mattered most. His mother, his father, Sirius, Lupin. They came not as strategy, but as the last mercy allowed to a boy who had become too good at marching toward unbearable conclusions. He listened. Not because he needed permission, because for once he wanted company in the final corridor. Then he closed his hand around the stone, let it fall away, and kept walking. Voldemort received him exactly as Harry had expected, with audience, with theater, with the deep satisfaction of a man who believed history had finally narrowed to his preferred shape. That was the weakness. Always had been. Voldemort wanted not merely victory, but witnessed victory. A story others would repeat exactly as he intended it. Harry understood that because Tommy Shelby had built smaller versions of the same instinct his whole life. Men like that did not simply kill enemies. They staged conclusions, so Harry gave him the stage. He offered no speech, no defiance, no last-minute plea. He stood still. And when Voldemort cast the killing curse, Harry entered it not as a victim, but as the final piece of a structure built around the enemy's own ego. The fragment within him died. The strange white station space came and went like a place between ledgers, where the last balance could be seen if one was forced far enough outside oneself. Then he came back, not loudly, not publicly. That was the second half of the trap. Voldemort, believing himself triumphant, made the same mistake powerful men always made once convinced they had broken the central symbol opposing them. He wanted to show the corpse. He wanted the castle to see. He wanted grief turned into proof. Harry let him. The procession from the forest to the castle was the longest theater walk of Voldemort's life and the beginning of his defeat. Because by the time they reached the grounds, too many things had already shifted. The soul fragment in Harry was gone. Voldemort did not know that. The people at Hogwarts were not broken by the sight. They were enraged, horrified, grieving, but not broken. Neville Longbottom was still standing, and Nagini was now outside the safest control conditions she had ever had. That was the moment Harry had planned for. When Voldemort called for surrender and speeches and despair, when everyone gathered and the crowd held its breath between terror and refusal, Neville moved, sword, strike. Snake, Nagini's head hit the ground before half the watchers understood what had changed. The scream that came out of Voldemort then was not theatrical, it was real. And that was the beginning of the end. Harry rose into the chaos a heartbeat later, tearing the last of the false death away in front of the very audience Voldemort had assembled for his own myth. Gasps, cries. shock turning instantly into renewed battle. Voldemort had wanted a legend. Harry gave him a trap sprung in public. The duel in the Great Hall that followed mattered less as raw spellwork than as culmination. Yes, wands were raised. Yes, curses flew. But the real battle had already been won in layers beneath the visible one. The Horcruxes were gone. His inner circle had been fractured by fear, debt, and loss. His symbolic invulnerability had been punctured in front of witnesses. His final living anchor had died at Neville's hand. And worst of all for a man like Voldemort, the crowd watching no longer believed entirely in him. That mattered. Belief was part of his armor. Harry faced him across the wrecked hall and understood with perfect clarity that the final exchange no longer required elaborate cunning, only discipline. Voldemort still needed speech, needed explanation, needed the room. Harry let him speak just enough, answered just enough, and then ended it when the opening came, not with rage, not with spectacle, with finish. The curse rebounded on the man who had spent his whole life building outward from the refusal to accept that other people were real. Voldemort died, this time, finally, as a man. And silence hit the great hall like weather breaking. Winning, Harry discovered, was the least restful part. He did not walk from the hall into celebration. He walked into negotiation. That too had been planned. By dawn, in a smaller chamber off the great hall that still smelled faintly of smoke and stone dust, Harry sat at a long table with surviving members of the Order. 3 Wisengamot members who had arrived very quickly once it became clear there would still be a government to salvage. The Gringotts branch manager representing interests no one dared pretend were peripheral, McGonagall, Kingsley, and 2 neutral family heads who had chosen survival correctly the night before. No crown, no office, no title, just seat. That was enough, perhaps more than enough. The post-war settlement began there, not later in clean robes under official portraits. Asset protections, emergency authority transfers, prosecution structure, amnesty boundaries, security reform, school governance, goblin claims review, reconstruction funds. Family disarmament terms for those who had bent late enough to avoid outright annihilation. Harry spoke rarely, but when he did, rooms listened. Not because he was beloved, because he had won in the only currency all of them respected at last: consequence. Kingsley would later become minister. McGonagall would take Hogwarts. Trials would come. Reforms would stall and resume and change shape, as all real reforms do, but none of them, not one, would begin from a world in which Harry Potter had no seat at the table, and Harry wanted it that way. Tommy had taught him years ago that titles could be removed. Debts, leverage, and indispensability were harder. By late afternoon, the immediate terms were set. Not peace, not justice complete, but framework, enough. At last, Harry stood, left the room, and found a quiet desk in what had once been a side office for deputy heads. The window was cracked. The castle beyond it was wounded and standing. Voices moved somewhere down the corridor. Hammers had already begun. That, more than anything, felt like Britain, history not pausing even for apocalypse. He took out parchment, dipped the pen, and wrote a letter to Small Heath. No report, no analysis, no file attached, just 4 words: the business is settled. He folded it, sealed it, and sat there for a moment with the finished thing in his hand. Not because he didn't know what came next. He did: reconstruction, politics, grief finally catching up, names of the dead to be carried correctly, the living to be kept from wasting the victory by turning it too quickly into myth. But for that 1 minute, in the quiet after the final accounting, Harry allowed himself not strategy, not posture, not leadership. Just the knowledge that the war had ended on terms he had not chosen freely, but had forced into being because no one else alive had been willing or able to hold every layer at once. A door opened softly behind him. He didn't turn until Hermione said, "I wondered where you'd gone." Ron entered next, looking exhausted beyond language. Neville after him, still carrying himself like a man who had crossed some invisible border in the night and not gone back. Harry placed the sealed letter on the desk. "Administrative work," he said. Ron let out one cracked laugh. "You are unbelievable." Hermione came to stand beside him and looked out over the broken grounds. "We won," she said, and it sounded less like triumph than verification. Harry nodded once. "Yes." Neville rested a hand against the window frame. "It doesn't feel finished." Harry looked at him. "No," he said. "It feels settled." That was different, less comforting, more true. The four of them stood there in the tired light, not children anymore and not yet whatever history would decide to call them. Outside, Hogwarts endured. Inside, papers shifted, floors were mended, and the world began the difficult work of surviving what had just been decided for it. Harry Potter, raised by the Peaky blinders, had not won because he was the strongest wizard alive. He had won because he understood the board. He had learned that power without structure rotted into spectacle, that institutions without courage became theaters for cowards, that loyalty earned honestly was stronger than control, that the enemy's ego was often the cleanest blade to use against him, and that the hardest victories were the ones that demanded not just force or genius, but the willingness to pay the cost of seeing everything clearly and moving anyway, in Small Heath. Sometime later, Tommy Shelby would read the letter once, fold it, and say nothing for a long while. Polly would understand the silence, because some debts were not repaid by gratitude, only by result. And this one, at last, had been paid in full. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter.